From the very beginning of Egyptian civilization, the high priest of Ptah held immense authority within the kingdom. Since the nation's unification, Memphis had served as the capital, and Ptah, its primary god, made the city a key religious center. As a result, Ptah's leading priest, known in ancient ceremonial terms as the greatest of craftsmen, was among the highest-ranking religious figures, charged with upholding Egypt's sacred traditions. Although officially appointed by the king, this role often passed down through generations, adhering more closely to the deeply rooted ideal of heredity than to royal decree. During the Ptolemaic period, one powerful family controlled the office continuously for more than 260 years, with each generation handing the position to the next. These priests not only preserved their lineage but also maintained strong loyalty to the monarchy, becoming one of the most influential native dynasties in the kingdom. In contrast to the priests of Ammonius in Thebes, who showed only modest support for the Greek rulers, the priests of Ptah and Memphis were unwavering allies of the Ptolemies. They freely offered their religious endorsement in return for royal favor. Although their counterparts in the south might have viewed such loyalty with disdain, this pragmatic cooperation was, in many ways, consistent with long-standing Egyptian traditions. At the time of Cleopatra's birth in 69 BCE, the reigning high priest of Ptah, Pasherenah, had more reason than most of his forebears to align closely with the ruling regime. He assumed the role at just 15 years old and, early in his service, had the honor of crowning Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII. As a member of the king's inner circle, Pasherenah enjoyed considerable influence and could confidently claim a role at the very heart of Egypt's leadership. Over the next 4 decades, the paths of Cleopatra and Pasherenah would remain closely linked. Their relationship, between a powerful priest and a royal heir, marks the beginning of the final chapter in ancient Egypt's long history. From birth, Cleopatra was treated as semi-divine. Her father was exalted as the new Dionysus, or, in Egyptian tradition, the young Osiris. The established royal cult of the Ptolemies, deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious customs, upheld the notion of the king as a living god. The priesthood, led by Pasherenah, had no qualms about embracing and endorsing the divinity of the royal family. Such beliefs had been part of Egyptian theology since its earliest days. However, Ptolemy Xi's reign was far from prosperous. Rather than enjoying wealth from agriculture and trade, his rule saw a sharp and steady decline in national stability. At the core of Egypt's troubles was the burden of protection payments. The country was no longer a dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. Of the once expansive Ptolemaic territories, only Cyprus remained, governed by the king's brother. Meanwhile, Rome had emerged as a powerful force, intent on expanding its reach. For countries like Egypt, there were only 2 choices: resist and face destruction, or submit and collaborate. By 75 BCE, Rome had already taken control of Cyrenaica, another Ptolemaic possession. Determined not to lose Egypt, Ptolemy XII chose to align with Rome, the lesser of 2 evils. Rome, ever predatory, was quick to exploit any vulnerability. A legal will left by Ptolemy X, which appeared to grant Egypt to Rome, gave the empire all the justification it needed to begin extracting wealth from the Nile Valley. Egypt had little choice but to comply. Payment was non-negotiable. When Cleopatra was only 4 years old, these realities became undeniable. Far away in the Roman Senate, ambitious leaders began using Egypt as a political bargaining chip. In 65 BCE, Crassus proposed turning Egypt into a Roman province. The idea was challenged by Cicero, who argued it would destabilize the Republic, and so it was delayed for a time. Rome's attention then shifted to an easier conquest, the Seleucid kingdom of Western Asia. Pompey the Great quickly crushed this longtime rival of the Ptolemies and brought it under Roman control. Eager to align himself with Rome's rising power, Ptolemy XII responded by sending 8,000 cavalrymen to assist Pompey's campaign in Palestine. While this generous act was meant to secure favor, it came at a steep cost. The Egyptian treasury was depleted, leading to increased taxes and reduced public services, sparking civil unrest. Despite this, maintaining Rome's approval remained Ptolemy's top priority, regardless of the strain it placed on his people. Pompey, embodying Roman arrogance, offered no help when the tax hikes triggered a rebellion. His indifference only underscored Egypt's vulnerable position, trapped between maintaining internal stability and appeasing a powerful foreign overlord. Egypt should have taken a lesson from this unfortunate experience, but its overly trusting approach to foreign affairs seemed to have a momentum of its own. As the nation sank deeper into debt to its overbearing protector, resentment among Egyptians toward Rome and all it represented grew steadily. This boded poorly for the stability of the Ptolemaic dynasty. To complicate matters further, Rome was being pulled in two directions by rival power players. Pleasing Pompey alone was insufficient. Julius Caesar wielded just as much influence. Egypt faced a double-edged threat and needed to appease both sides. In 59 BCE, when Caesar hinted that he would raise the Egyptian question again in the Roman Senate, Ptolemy responded with his usual tactic. He paid a massive bribe, amounting to half of Egypt's annual income, in exchange for formal acknowledgement as the rightful king of Egypt and as a friend and ally of the Roman people. Yet this gesture brought little benefit. Within a year, while Ptolemy was celebrating the wedding of his close ally, High Priest Pasherenta, to a 14-year-old girl, Rome seized Cyprus. The island's ruler, Ptolemy's brother, took his own life, and the joyous occasion quickly turned tragic. Still, Ptolemy remained silent, unwilling to provoke Roman wrath. By this point, the king's moral integrity was as depleted as his nation's finances. For the proud citizens of Alexandria, it was too much to bear. Outraged, they rose in revolt and expelled their king, sending him into exile. A disgraced Ptolemy first traveled to Rhodes to plead his case before the Roman official who had accepted Cyprus's surrender. In a final indignity, he was forced to meet Marcus Porcius Cato while the magistrate sat on the toilet, thanks to a particularly effective laxative. Once, pharaohs had ruled over foreign nations. Now, one had been reduced to less than an afterthought, a humiliating reminder of how far Egypt had fallen. Yet instead of reassessing its situation, the Ptolemaic dynasty clung to the same self-destructive patterns. In Alexandria, the throne was first offered to Ptolemy's wife, and, after her sudden death, to his eldest daughter, Berenike. The idea of a woman ruling alone was deeply offensive to Greek tradition, so the search began for a male consort. But Berenike, true to her bloodline, proved as ruthless and defiant as her forebears. Her first intended husband died on the journey. The second was intercepted by Roman authorities before crossing into Egypt. And the third, having arrived in Alexandria, was strangled within days when Berenike found him completely unworthy. Meanwhile, Ptolemy traveled from Rhodes to Ephesus, and then on to Rome, where he stayed for 2 years beginning in 57 BCE. While in exile, he played the classic role of the deposed autocrat, ordering the elimination of his political enemies back home while enjoying a lavish lifestyle in foreign mansions. Eventually, he secured what he had come for, in return for a staggering sum of 10,000 talents, the equivalent of Egypt's full annual revenue, borrowed from a banker named Rabirius, who could hardly believe his good fortune. Ptolemy secured military backing for his return. The Roman governor of Syria, Gabinius, agreed to lead the campaign. On April 15, 55 BCE, with Gabinius and his troops at his side, Ptolemy marched triumphantly back into Alexandria. He reclaimed the throne, executed his daughter Berenike, and rewarded Rabirius by appointing him finance minister. At that point, Egypt wasn't just under Rome's influence. It had become little more than a financial extension of the Roman Empire. For Ptolemy XII, regaining the throne came at the cost of complete humiliation. During his 2-year exile in Rome, Ptolemy XII seemed to find solace in the company of a cherished companion. Evidence suggests that one of his daughters accompanied him on his journey through Rhodes, Ephesus, and Rome. While her exact identity remains uncertain, Cleopatra is the most plausible candidate. At the time of her father's expulsion, she was 11 years old enough to travel, yet young enough to leave Egypt without being seen as a threat to her older sister, Berenike. If Cleopatra did indeed spend those formative years in Rome, the experience would have taught her critical political lessons. Ptolemaic rulers could not fully submit to Roman authority, nor could they afford to ignore it. To keep the crown and safeguard national sovereignty required exceptional finesse and the ability to navigate an incredibly narrow path. Cleopatra would soon be walking that path alone. Upon returning to Egypt, Ptolemy XII quickly moved to consolidate his position with the priesthood and the broader population. Since the days of Narmer, Egyptian kings had strengthened their legitimacy by building temples and touring religious sites. Nearly 3,000 years later, Ptolemy saw no need to deviate from this tradition. He commissioned the construction of a grand new temple to the goddess Hathor at Unearth in Upper Egypt, laying its foundation stone on July 16, 54 BCE. Around the same time, he made an official visit to Memphis, accompanied by Pasherenta, the high priest of Ptah and a key figure in the native elite. These actions were calculated demonstrations of pharaonic authority. To further secure his family's future, Ptolemy named Cleopatra as his formal co-ruler in 52 BCE. After nearly 30 years of precarious rule, he may have sensed that the end was near. On March 7, 51 BCE, a solar eclipse cast a shadow over Egypt, widely interpreted as a foreboding omen. Days later, Ptolemy XII died, and Cleopatra ascended to the throne at just 17. According to her father's wishes, Cleopatra was to rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, while Rome was appointed guardian of their reign. Like many Ptolemaic power-sharing arrangements, it was bound for conflict. Initially, Cleopatra attempted to govern independently, sidelining her young brother and taking control for the first year and a half. However, a string of environmental and political misfortunes soon eroded public support. In the summer of 50 BCE, an abnormally low Nile flood resulted in poor harvests and food shortages. To stave off famine, Cleopatra implemented emergency policies. Yet her inability to secure the favor of the gods so early in her reign cast a shadow over her legitimacy. She worsened her standing by agreeing to extradite fugitives from Syria who had assassinated the sons of a Roman governor. Sending them to their deaths reinforced widespread fears that Egypt was now under Rome's thumb. Public opinion quickly shifted, favoring her brother over her. At the same time, Cleopatra faced growing tension beyond Egypt's borders. Rome was being torn apart by civil war between its two most powerful generals, Pompey and Caesar. Out of loyalty to her father's former benefactor, Cleopatra aligned with Pompey, whose ally Gabinius had previously reinstated Ptolemy XII. But even a Roman alliance couldn't shield her from the backlash at home. In early 48 BCE, Cleopatra, like her father before her, was driven into exile. This time, however, she didn't turn to Rome. Instead, she set out to raise an army in nearby Palestine, where she still commanded loyalty. By late summer, Egypt stood divided, with opposing forces rallying behind Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, ready for confrontation in the eastern Nile Delta. Ptolemy XIII, already officially recognized by Rome as the sole ruler of Egypt, likely felt emboldened in his position. But when Pompey, freshly defeated by Caesar in Greece, sought refuge in Egypt on August 9, 48 BCE, Ptolemy's confidence veered into recklessness. Standing by the harbor in Alexandria, he watched without emotion as Pompey was brought ashore, only to be immediately stabbed to death by one of his former officers, now loyal to Ptolemy. The Roman general never even stepped onto Egyptian soil. Ptolemy may have believed that eliminating Caesar's enemy would win him favor, but he had gravely misjudged the situation. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria just 4 days later and was presented with Pompey's severed and preserved head, he reacted with fury at the brutal murder of a fellow Roman. He went directly to the royal palace, made it his residence, and summoned Ptolemy XIII for a meeting. Recognizing the significance of Caesar's arrival, now the undisputed master of Rome, Cleopatra saw a critical opportunity. Avoiding her brother's guards, she slipped into the palace undetected and joined Caesar's audience. So began one of history's most legendary encounters. In the oppressive August heat of Alexandria, Cleopatra, 21 years old, met Caesar, aged 52. By modern standards, her sharp features, an aquiline nose, and narrow chin might not be called beautiful, and Caesar, weathered from years of military campaigns, was far from youthful. Still, attraction is often shaped by power, and the connection between them sparked immediately. To the shock and outrage of Ptolemy XIII and his followers, Caesar backed Cleopatra's claim to the throne. In retaliation, Ptolemy's forces surrounded the palace, while his allies in the city declared Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, queen in her place. But the tide turned quickly. In March of 47 BCE, Roman reinforcements arrived, broke the siege, and violent clashes erupted. During the chaos, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. With her rival gone, Cleopatra was reinstated as ruler, this time sharing the throne with her younger brother, another Ptolemy, just 11 years old. As a further gesture of Roman support, Cyprus was returned to Egypt. Arsinoe was captured and taken to Italy as a prisoner. To mark their victory, Cleopatra and Caesar journeyed up the Nile together. But the presence of 400 Roman warships accompanying them offered little joy to the Egyptian people. Cleopatra had secured her position, but Egypt had paid the price. 3 Roman legions remained stationed in the Nile Valley, a stark reminder of the new reality. Caesar, in his writings, made the purpose of this military presence clear. The king and queen would be protected by Roman troops so long as they remained loyal. If they defied Rome, those same forces would ensure their compliance. Caesar's departure wasn't the end of his influence. In the summer of 47 BCE, after he left Egypt to resume his campaigns, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. Unmistakably claiming his lineage, she named him Ptolemy Caesar. To commemorate the birth, Cleopatra ordered special coins to be minted in Cyprus. Adorned with the symbol of the double cornucopia, the coins celebrated the prosperity and promise of Egypt's union with Rome through her son. A year after Cleopatra's child was born, another arrival, this time to a different family, was celebrated with equal joy and gratitude. Unlike Cleopatra's experience, both parents were present to share the moment. The proud father was the high priest Pasherenta, and the mother was his wife of 12 years, Ptahhotep. Their happiness was especially profound, given the emotional hardship that had come before. In the early years of their marriage, Ptahhotep had given birth to 3 healthy daughters. While this was a blessing, it fell short of fulfilling Pasherenta's deepest wish for a male heir. In ancient Egypt, sons were essential, especially for a man of his stature. The high priest of Ptah and holder of a sacred office passed down through 11 generations. As he reached the age of 43, Pasherenta must have wondered whether his lineage would end with him. In her desperation, Ptahhotep turned to the ancient deities, and one god in particular, Imhotep. Once a royal courtier to the pharaoh Nefertiti during the dawn of the Pyramid Age, Imhotep had become revered as a god of wisdom, healing, and magical power. His greatest achievement, the Step Pyramid, still dominated the skyline of Memphis, where his cult remained especially strong. Ptahhotep herself, a native of Memphis, carried his name, making the connection even more personal. If any divine being could grant their wish for a son, it would surely be Imhotep. So, she prayed alongside her husband to the god renowned for granting children to the childless. Amazingly, her prayers were answered. Imhotep appeared to her in a dream, promising that she would bear a son, on the condition that she arranged to beautify his shrine in Memphis. A sacred exchange was struck. If she honored him, he would bless her. With Pasherenta being one of the most powerful figures in the city and head of the local religious establishment, the shrine was quickly restored. Builders and artisans must have worked swiftly. On the afternoon of July 15th, 46 BCE, Ptahhotep delivered a long-awaited son. The city of Memphis erupted in celebration. He was named Imhotep, also called Patabastet, and was welcomed with overwhelming joy. For Ptahhotep, the birth of a son fulfilled her duty as a wife and safeguarded her husband's legacy. In Cleopatra's case, however, the arrival of her own son carried greater symbolic and religious meaning. To honor the birth of Caesarion, Little Caesar, Cleopatra consecrated a rooftop sanctuary at Unearth, a temple devoted to the mother goddess Hathor. In another sacred city, Unearth, known to the Greeks as Hermonthis, she built a birth house to glorify the divine act of creation. In Ptolemy and Alexandria, Egypt's prominent Hellenistic cities, Cleopatra also advanced the worship of Isis, a beloved Egyptian goddess whom she personally identified with. Isis, known as a divine mother and protector, had long been venerated for shielding her son Horus, and many saw echoes of that relationship in Cleopatra and her child. The royal image makers of the day encouraged the comparison, blending Isis's traditional symbols with Cleopatra's likeness. In doing so, they merged goddess and queen into a single sacred figure. Cleopatra possessed a stronger claim to being an Egyptian deity than any of her Ptolemaic predecessors. Unlike the kings before her, she made the effort to learn the Egyptian language, signaling a deeper connection to the land she ruled. She clearly regarded Egypt as her true home and took active steps to honor its time-honored religious traditions. Embracing a feminine form of the Horus title, one of the most ancient and sacred expressions of divine kingship, she earned recognition from many Egyptians as a legitimate pharaoh. It is therefore somewhat surprising that, during the height of her popularity, Cleopatra chose to leave Egypt and accompany Caesar to Rome upon his return from campaign in 46 BCE. For 2 years, she resided at his estate across the Tiber River. Their relationship quickly became the subject of gossip, especially after Caesar commissioned a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix. His plans to propose legislation allowing him to marry outside of Italy, despite being already married, have children with a foreign queen, and potentially establish a new capital city, fed into Roman fears. Many believe that their revered general was falling under the spell of an exotic Eastern ruler. Those concerns evaporated with Caesar's assassination on March 15, 44 BCE. Within a month, Cleopatra departed Rome and returned to Alexandria. Not long after, her co-regent and younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, died under circumstances that raised no questions. She then installed her son Caesarion as king, under the name Ptolemy XV, styling him the god who loves his father and mother. To Cleopatra, the parallels between her life and the divine narratives of Egypt were becoming ever clearer. Caesar, like Osiris, had been slain. Caesarion, like Horus, was the heir of a murdered father, and she herself, now a widowed queen, had fully assumed the role of the living Isis. Despite Cleopatra's rise to near-divine stature, it seemed the gods had turned their backs on Egypt. A series of poor Nile floods between 43 and 41 BCE led to food shortages that plagued both cities and the countryside. Desperation spread among the people. With spirits broken and stomachs empty, they could no longer find comfort in the thought of the afterlife. Rather than a peaceful continuation of life, death came to be feared, seen as an extension of earthly suffering. 2,000 years of religious faith began to unravel. No one captured this growing despair more powerfully than Ptahhotep. On February 15th, 42 BCE, she died at the age of 30, leaving behind her husband, her long-awaited son, and 3 daughters. As the wife of the high priest of Ptah, her funerary monument was carved from fine pale limestone and adorned with intricate artistry by Egypt's most skilled craftsmen. The upper panel displayed a delicate scene of Ptahhotep paying homage to the most revered gods of the land: Anubis, the embalmer; Horus, the divine sun; Nephthys and Isis, Osiris's mourning sisters; the sacred Apis bull of Memphis; and Soker Osiris, the ruler of the dead. The iconography reflected Egypt's enduring religious legacy, but the inscription beneath told a different story. Written in 21 lines of beautifully inscribed hieroglyphs, the text expressed a sorrowful, almost defiant message, one that captured the somber mood of the age. "O my brother, my husband, my friend, high priest, do not tire of eating, drinking, making love, and enjoying life. Celebrate. Follow your heart day and night. Let no worry settle in your heart. What value are your years otherwise? For the West is the land of sleep. Darkness hangs over the place of the dead." Amenhotep's epitaph remains one of the most intimate and sorrowful laments from ancient Egypt. It is a haunting reflection of a civilization coming to terms with the erosion of its ancient assurances and divine order. The outlook for Egypt and its people had grown increasingly grim. With Caesar's assassination, the country lost its most powerful protector. It was uncertain how his assassins or his successors would now treat Cleopatra and her kingdom. Adding to the tension, Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe, recently released from captivity in Rome and now residing in Ephesus, became a natural rallying point for those discontented within the Ptolemaic territories. Cleopatra's resolve was put to the test as first Cassius, then Mark Antony and Octavian, approached Egypt seeking military support. Relying on her sharp political instincts, she aligned herself with Caesar's loyal followers. Her gamble paid off when Antony triumphed over Cassius and Brutus at the Battle of Philippi, securing Egypt's safety, at least temporarily. But that safety came with an unexpected cost: Cleopatra's entanglement with another powerful Roman general. It's possible that Cleopatra and Antony first met in 55 BCE, when he served in Egypt as a young cavalry commander under Gabinius. They may have crossed paths again during Cleopatra's 2-year stay in Rome between 46 and 44 BCE. Their real connection, however, began during their third encounter. In the summer of 41 BCE, after a formal alliance had been formed between Egypt and Caesar's successors, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in southeastern Anatolia. Fresh from his victory at Philippi, Antony was preparing to challenge the Parthians, Rome's remaining major rival in the east. For this, he needed a strategic base in the eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt was the perfect option. At the same time, Cleopatra was in desperate need of a new Roman ally. Their meeting, therefore, was one of mutual interest. With her signature flair for symbolism and spectacle, Cleopatra transformed their diplomatic encounter into something far more theatrical. She arrived by boat, portraying herself as the goddess Aphrodite, merged with the Egyptian Isis, coming to greet her divine partner, Dionysus. The comparison surely flattered Antony, who was both captivated by her charisma and seduced by the allure of a queen 14 years his junior. Like Caesar before him, Antony offered his support in return for her companionship. Even the sorrowful news of Pascherina's death on July 14th failed to dampen Cleopatra's enthusiasm. By the end of the year, the pair had returned together to Alexandria. 9 months later, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named after the sun and the moon, symbolic children of a supposedly divine union. But the illusion of a heavenly match quickly shattered. Soon after the twins were born, Antony left Egypt and returned to Rome. There, he brokered a political alliance with his rival Octavian by marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia, thus abandoning Cleopatra. The Queen of Egypt should perhaps have recognized the pattern. An affair with a Roman general rarely ended well, and once again she found herself raising children alone. Despite Antony's absence, Egypt enjoyed a temporary period of calm. For the next 3 years, the kingdom was largely free from the constant upheaval, rebellions, power struggles, and political schemes that had long characterized Ptolemaic rule. The young Imhotep, only 7 years old, was appointed high priest of Ptah, inheriting the sacred role passed down through his lineage. Meanwhile, the Nile's annual flooding returned to its normal levels, revitalizing agriculture and bringing some much-needed relief. Had it not been for the massive foreign debt inherited from Ptolemy Xi's administration, Egypt's economy might have fully recovered. But as it stood, the treasury was depleted. The country's silver coinage, once high in purity, was reduced from 90% to 40%, and then nearly disappeared altogether. In its place, the economy relied increasingly on bronze currency. Egypt's legendary wealth was no longer enriching its own people. It was being siphoned off to fuel Rome's ambitions. Eager to conquer Parthia and further elevate his reputation, Antony had, by the autumn of 37 BCE, concluded that Octavian would not offer his support. Once again, Egypt appeared to be the most promising ally. Antony journeyed eastward to Antioch, where he arranged a second meeting with Cleopatra. As a gesture of goodwill, he gifted her the vast library of the kings of Pergamum, said to contain 200,000 scrolls, a symbolic replacement for the books lost from the Library of Alexandria during Caesar's conflict with Pompey years earlier. Antony also granted Cleopatra control over various Roman territories across the eastern Mediterranean, allowing her to present herself as a revivalist monarch restoring her ancestors' once mighty empire. To mark this supposed resurgence, she initiated a new dating system, declaring the 16th year of her reign as the beginning of a new era. But it was an illusion. The lands Antony handed over weren't his to give. In exchange for genuine military aid and supplies, Cleopatra received dubious political titles and a collection of texts. In earlier times, Egypt had been feared and revered as the dominant force in Asia. Now, it was little more than Rome's obedient provider. Due to inadequate planning and an overconfident approach, Antony's initial campaign against Parthia ended in complete failure. Within months, he lost a third of his infantry and nearly half his cavalry to a determined foe. The only bright spot of that year was the birth of another son by Cleopatra, Ptolemy Philadelphus. In 34 BCE, a renewed offensive brought Cleopatra to the Euphrates River with Antony. While his campaign resulted in only a modest success in Armenia, Antony staged a grand spectacle in Alexandria to inflate the victory's significance. During what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra appeared in public on silver thrones, she styled as the goddess Isis. Antony boldly declared their children rulers of Rome's eastern provinces. Cleopatra and Caesarion were assigned Egypt, Cyprus, Cyrenaica, and Coele Syria. Alexander Helios, adorned in Persian attire, was given dominion over Armenia, Media, and Parthia, despite Parthia never having been conquered. Meanwhile, the toddler Ptolemy Philadelphus, dressed in Macedonian fashion, was awarded Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. The two sons were acclaimed kings of kings, destined to govern a reborn Eastern Empire. But this was pure fantasy. Cleopatra's enthusiastic participation and open support for Antony provoked Rome's scorn. Senators and citizens alike viewed these Eastern monarchic dreams with deep suspicion and disdain. A remarkable papyrus from this turbulent time offers insight into Egypt's worsening condition. Dated February 23, 33 BCE, it records a royal decree granting extraordinary tax exemptions to Publius Canidius, Antony's chief military aide. Cleopatra authorized him to export 10,000 sacks of wheat annually, emphasizing Egypt's role as Rome's granary, and to import 5,000 amphorae of wine, all tax-free. Furthermore, he and his tenants were exempted from taxation on his Egyptian estates, effectively placing him outside the kingdom's financial laws. As political favors go, this one was massive and audacious. The order was addressed to a top official in Alexandria with instructions to disseminate the policy. At the bottom, the Greek word genestoi, meaning make it happen, was added. It may have been Cleopatra's own handwriting. If so, this was less a tax ruling than a signature on her own demise. Throughout 33 BCE, it became clear once more that Rome could not tolerate two dominant leaders. With control over the eastern territories and allies in the Senate, Antony seemed to have the upper hand. But Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and legal heir, was equally resolute. Just as Caesar and Pompey had clashed years earlier, so too did Antony and Octavian allow personal ambition to spiral into full-blown civil war. Cleopatra's deep alignment with Antony made her an easy target. Octavian portrayed her as the foreign seductress corrupting a Roman hero, using her to draw a sharp line between his own image as the noble Roman and Antony's perceived betrayal. Even though Cleopatra's ruler, Caesarion, was Caesar's biological son, that did not matter to Octavian. To him, Cleopatra symbolized everything foreign and dangerous to Roman ideals. Now, both her fate and the fate of Egypt hinged entirely on the outcome of Rome's internal strife. As tensions escalated between the rival Roman factions, Cleopatra and Antony set sail from Alexandria at the head of a fleet of 200 Egyptian vessels. After brief stops in Ephesus and Samos, they eventually arrived in Athens. There, Antony publicly renounced Octavia, formally severing his connection with Octavian's camp. When spring arrived in 31 BCE, the conflict officially erupted into war. It quickly became clear that Antony's inflated ambitions were not matched by strategic competence. By early September, his troops were cornered in western Greece, and his fleet was trapped in a large bay. The only viable option left was to attempt a naval escape under enemy fire. The Battle of Actium on September 2nd was less a grand confrontation and more a chaotic retreat. Antony and Cleopatra managed to escape with their lives and only 60 of their 230 ships. He headed to Libya. She returned to Alexandria. Understanding that defeated leaders rarely survived, Cleopatra made efforts to disguise their return as a triumph. Her ships were adorned to give the illusion of victory. When Antony arrived at the palace days later, they both worked to maintain a facade of stability. A grand celebration was held to mark Caesarion's coming of age, a royal ceremony designed to entertain the public and distract them from the grim political reality. Meanwhile, the mechanisms of government continued to function. Decrees were issued, taxes collected. In Jebtu, a guild of linen makers finalized a contract with 2 priests to fund the local bull cult, a reminder of the enduring Egyptian blend of bureaucracy and religious devotion. To some, it may have seemed that pharaonic tradition would endure forever. Yet behind this show of continuity, Cleopatra was frantically preparing for permanent exile. She had what remained of her fleet dragged overland from the Nile to the Red Sea, hoping to send Caesarion to safety in India. But her plans were foiled when local Nabatean tribes torched the vessels, cutting off her escape. As Octavian's army approached from Syria, with another force advancing from Cyrenaica, Cleopatra sent a final plea. She would abdicate in favor of her children if Egypt were spared. Octavian gave no response. On July 29th, 30 BCE, Imhotep, the high priest of Ptah, died at just 16 years old. Whether due to natural weakness or political execution, his death marked the symbolic end of a 3-century line that had preserved Egypt's sacred heritage. Just 3 days later, on August 1st, Egypt fell to Rome. As Octavian's legions marched on Alexandria by both land and sea, Antony led his remaining troops into the city for a final stand. But exhausted from years of war, his forces were swiftly crushed. As Octavian entered Alexandria, Cleopatra retreated to her fortified mausoleum treasury in the royal quarter. What followed has become legend. Believing that Cleopatra had already taken her own life, Antony stabbed himself. At her urgent request, his dying body was lifted into her chamber, where he passed away in her arms. Soon after, Cleopatra was deceived into leaving her sanctuary and was immediately taken into custody at the royal palace. Just 10 more golden sunsets passed over Alexandria before, on August 12th, Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, followed her Roman lover into death. Her life, though relatively brief, had been marked by intense upheaval. She had witnessed one sister deposed and executed, and another led in chains through Rome as a war prize. Faced with the options of execution or lifelong captivity, Ending her own life must have seemed the most dignified choice. Whether by an ASP concealed in a basket of figs or a poisoned hairpin, the exact means remains a mystery. Cleopatra passed into history, but her legacy endured. 400 years later, worshippers were still tending to her image in Roman shrines. 2 millennia on, her story and romances continue to fascinate the Western imagination. Her presence still lingers. So does the world she came from. In the years since her death, the Nile Valley has become a battleground for Romans, Arabs, Christians, and Muslims. Time and the blazing Egyptian sun have faded the once vibrant temples to sun-washed ruins. Tombs have been looted, pyramids stripped of their gleaming tops. Yet the mystique of pharaonic Egypt, immortalized through its last queen, has proven remarkably enduring. Among Cleopatra's physical legacies, the Temple of Hathor at Unearth stands as her most grandiose architectural contribution. From its colonnaded front, the gentle face of the goddess, half woman, half cow, still gazes out in timeless guardianship, just as it did when it watched over depictions of Narmer, Egypt's first pharaoh. The symbols and ideology of divine kingship, perhaps the Egyptians' greatest invention, remained intact at the end as they had been at the dawn. As the final bearer of this ancient lineage, Cleopatra's deepest desire was to secure her dynasty's future. On the rear wall of the temple, she is shown beside her son, Ptolemy 15 Caesarion, making offerings to the gods, mirroring the royal rituals performed by generations of her ancestors. In her vision, she stood as Isis Hathor, the divine mother. He was Horus, destined to avenge his fallen father and reign over Egypt in majesty. But like many of Cleopatra's ambitions, destiny had other plans. Caesarion was executed by Octavian only days after Alexandria's collapse. The Ptolemaic line ended with him, along with the age of the pharaohs. Still, inscribed alongside this final image of divine kingship, the stonework of Cleopatra's temple carries a deeper, more lasting message. Carved next to the figure of her son are 4 simple hieroglyphs: a sandal strap, a snake, a loaf, and a stretch of fertile land. These symbols encapsulate the essence of ancient Egypt and form a phrase bestowed upon kings throughout history: Ankh Jet, living forever. It is a fitting farewell, not just to Cleopatra, but to the civilization she represented. Cleopatra's death handed Egypt over to Roman control, just as she had feared. With her passing, the long-standing tradition of pharaonic independence, spanning 3 millennia, came to an irreversible end. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire as the personal possession of its ruler, to be exploited at will. For the next 4 centuries, Augustus and the emperors who followed capitalized on Egypt's legendary riches for their own benefit. Grain from Alexandria sustained Rome's enormous population. Gold from the eastern desert replenished the imperial treasury. Massive stone blocks from the Red Sea Mountains were shipped to embellish Roman public buildings. And the remote quarry at Mons Porphyrites supplied Rome's elite artisans with prized purple porphyry. However, Egypt's value to Rome went beyond just natural resources. With access to both the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, the country became a vital hub for Roman trade, particularly with India, the origin of the exotic goods so favored by Rome's elite. Egypt's geographic position at the crossroads of Asia, Africa, Europe, and Arabia had once been the foundation of its wealth and strength as an independent kingdom. That same strategic location now ensured its domination by successive foreign powers. Rome, Byzantium, and Persia, later the Caliphs, Ottomans, and British, all regarded Egypt as an unmatched center of trade and a source of wealth ripe for exploitation. Yet even amid centuries of conquest and extraction, there was an unexpected benefit. In the late 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte launched an expedition to Egypt, intending to seize it as a French colony, control key trade routes, and weaken Britain's grip on India. While the campaign is remembered for its strategic ambitions, its lasting legacy was something quite different: the birth of Egyptology. Though Bonaparte himself had little personal interest in uncovering Egypt's ancient past, he brought with him over 150 scholars when he departed from Toulon on May 20th, 1798. Their careful studies and observations, later published in the monumental Description de l'Égypte, laid the groundwork for the modern scientific study of ancient Egyptian civilization. Today, those scholars are celebrated as pioneers of Egyptology. But at the time, they were overshadowed by the thousands of soldiers and cavalrymen who accompanied them to the Nile. Of all the intellectuals on the expedition, the surveyors held the most strategic importance. Their mission was to assess whether a canal could be built between the Mediterranean and the Gulf of Suez. For Bonaparte, gaining military and commercial leverage far outweighed the pursuit of historical knowledge. And while the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson dealt a significant blow to the French at the Battle of the Nile, evoking memories of Egypt's own ancient naval clashes with the Sea Peoples, France's vision ultimately prevailed. The modern Suez Canal, a successor to Darius I's ancient engineering feat, was completed in 1869, transforming global trade forever. The echoes between Egypt's ancient legacy and its modern history extended well into the 20th century. Much like Napoleon before them, the expansionist ambitions of the Third Reich led Nazi Germany to target Egypt as a strategic prize, this time to control the vital oil trade routes of the Middle East. Axis armor divisions pushed toward the eastern Nile Delta, retracing paths once used by invading Libyan forces during Egypt's late New Kingdom era. The Allied victories at El Alamein in July and October of 1942 marked a decisive moment in World War II. Winston Churchill famously declared it the end of the beginning. Strikingly, just 14 years later, the Suez Crisis, yet another military clash centered on Egyptian territory, marked the beginning of the British Empire's unraveling. From the conflicts of antiquity to Cold War tensions and beyond, Egypt has remained at the crossroads of global power. As one might reflect, if only humanity could learn from history the wisdom it might reveal. In addition to its geopolitical relevance, Egypt's profound cultural influence has resonated for centuries. Since the days when Caesar journeyed up the Nile with Cleopatra, Egypt's spiritual legacy has traveled far beyond its borders. Along with more tangible exports, the cult of Isis spread across the Roman Empire, reaching as far as Britain's distant shores. Its influence was both widespread and enduring, particularly in the Near East, Egypt's historical sphere of influence. Despite Emperor Justinian's decree banning pagan religions in 553 AD, the rich traditions of ancient Egyptian worship continued to shape the development of early Christianity. The imagery of Isis nursing Horus would soon be mirrored in depictions of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. The visual symbolism and theological ideas remained strikingly familiar. On a subconscious level, pharaonic culture has captivated the Western imagination since Roman times. From the Egyptian-inspired motifs at Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli to the frescoes of Pompeii, and in modern times through Art Deco jewelry and the glitzy Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, ancient Egypt has remained a source of artistic and architectural inspiration. Various individuals and ideological movements have also found meaning in Egypt's past. Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh, has been variously claimed as an icon by Freudian psychoanalysts, Protestant reformers, fascists, Afrocentrists, New Age thinkers, and advocates for LGBTQ+ rights. Hollywood, too, has long been enchanted by Egypt's exotic mystique and ancient allure, producing a string of blockbuster films, from the Ten Commandments and Cleopatra to Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Scorpion King. In essence, despite successive transformations, from Roman rule and the rise of Christianity to the Arab conquest and the upheavals of modernity, ancient Egypt as a symbol and idea has not only endured but flourished. The pharaohs and their subjects forged a civilization of extraordinary resilience and cultural power, one that continues to enchant and inspire everyone from world conquerors to mystery writers. In art, literature, architecture, tourism, and popular culture, the the spirit of ancient Egypt remains vibrantly alive in the global imagination. The people of the Nile Valley could hardly have hoped for a more lasting legacy.
In 1279 BC, Ramesses II, who lends his name to this very account, to power as pharaoh of Egypt. Today, his name is renowned, but at the time of his ascension, most of the world's population had no awareness of his existence, or even of the land he governed. Similarly, Ramesses and his fellow Egyptians had only a limited understanding of the broader world beyond their borders. Though their knowledge surpassed that of Egyptians who had lived only a few centuries earlier, some members of Ramesses's court were aware of various foreign peoples discussed in this work. They had either encountered travelers from regions stretching from Nubia in the south to the Black Sea in northern Anatolia, and from the Greek mainland to western Iran, had themselves journeyed to those places. Beyond these boundaries, their awareness diminished significantly. While they may have seen artifacts from sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, or even Atlantic Europe, they likely had no idea who had made them. To modern historians, the world of 1279 BC remains largely a mystery, one that is difficult, if not impossible, to fully uncover. This is primarily because much of the global population left behind few, if any, tangible records. Vast numbers of people still did not practice agriculture or live in settled communities. Among those who did, only a minority formed urban societies, and fewer still developed written language. The traces of their lives are rare and often difficult to interpret. Prehistoric archaeologists have managed to reconstruct, to varying extents, aspects of life during the 13th century BC. However, we often lack even the most basic informations, such as what these people called themselves or the languages they spoke. At best, our understanding is limited to the material remnants of their daily existence. And in many cases, there are no remains at all, especially when people were constantly on the move, leaving no lasting evidence. The more materially advanced and complex a society was, the greater the chance that something of it still survives. Today, by the latter part of the second millennium BC, only 3 regions around the world had reached a level of societal development marked by urban centers, intricate social structures, and economic systems that had moved far beyond mere subsistence. These cultures were scattered far apart, and it's almost certain that each evolved independently. Our knowledge of these societies varies greatly. In Central America, the Olmec civilization was just beginning to take shape. Their peak would not come until after 1200 BC, slightly beyond the time frame of this study. Living along the southern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, the Olmecs practiced agriculture and resided in early urban settlements. They had not yet developed a writing system, though. By around 1250 BC, they had begun building monumental structures, which later became major religious centers. Despite some modern speculation, the Olmecs had no connections with cultures across the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. Their achievements arose in isolation. The 2 other highly developed cultures of the 13th century BC were situated at the far ends of Asia, along the outer reaches of a vast zone that lay between Central Asia's arid steppes and deserts, and the waters of the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Peninsula. These civilizations were small outposts on the expansive Eurasian continent, surrounded by largely rural or nomadic populations. Any interaction between them would have been indirect at best, and it is unlikely that either society was aware of the other's existence. From a historical standpoint, these 2 civilizations offer very different levels of accessibility. In East Asia, the Shang dynasty of China, located in the middle Yellow River Valley, began using a written script around 1200 BC. The writing that survives, mainly found on oracle bones and bronze vessels, offers limited insight, primarily consisting of royal names and brief records of specific events. The archaeological evidence from Shang China and nearby cultures is striking: fortified towns and villages, lavish tombs, and grand structures. Despite this, the region's early history is mostly reconstructed from later Chinese texts, and the inscriptions from the late 2nd millennium BC serve mainly to validate the names of kings recorded in those later narratives, in contrast to the East Asian situation. The western part of Asia, particularly the eastern Mediterranean coast, offered a very different picture. Along this stretch of land, multiple civilizations thrived side by side, leaving behind an abundance of written records, artifacts, and visual art that allow historians to study them in considerable depth. This was the world that Ramesses II and his court were familiar with. It included several powerful states considered equals to Egypt, and which we too know well today. Hatti, the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia and northern Syria. Babylonia in the south of present-day Iraq, and Assyria in the north of Iraq and eastern Syria. Beyond these lay the Mycenaean world of mainland Greece and the Aegean Islands. Along with the Elamite state in what is now southwestern Iran, smaller polities also dotted the west coast of Anatolia, the Syro-Palestinian corridor in the island of Cyprus. Previously, northern Syria had been unified under the kingdom of Mitanni. The people of these regions lived in cities, adorned with monumental structures, and led lives filled with economic and cultural activity. They left behind a wealth of evidence about their world writings, tools, architecture that gives us detailed insight into their identities, languages, occupations, religious beliefs, and many other aspects of their lives. For its time, this level of documentation is extraordinary. If we imagine the globe of that era as mostly dark, with light shining only where historical sources survive, the eastern Mediterranean is the one region clearly illuminated. Not surprisingly, global histories built on empirical data often center on this area, commonly calling it the cradle of civilization. This book focuses on that very region, the eastern Mediterranean world. It is important to recognize how unusual it was for its time, a bright spot surrounded by vast areas of which we know very little. However, this surrounding world was not isolated. What occurred there could influence, and often did influence, the better documented cultures around the Mediterranean. Our knowledge of these outer regions is mostly indirect, drawn from later parallels or the fleeting moments when people from these areas entered the Mediterranean zone or traded goods with it. While it is easy to get lost in the richness of the sources we do have, we must not forget how much remains hidden. We often speak of studying the world, when in truth, we are observing only a tiny, visible corner of it. The Eastern Mediterranean cultures can be examined from many angles, as evidenced by the vast number of scholarly books and articles dedicated to them. The surviving sources allow for the reconstruction of political, economic, social, diplomatic, religious, and cultural histories both for individual cultures and across them collectively. One of the defining traits of this region during this era is its internationalism. These states, better referred to as polities, since the modern term nation does not apply, were well aware of one another's presence and maintained extensive diplomatic and commercial relations. Many of them saw themselves as members of a shared system, with established hierarchies among participants. The depth and breadth of their interactions are unmatched in the ancient world. This has drawn much scholarly attention. Historically, this research has centered primarily on political dynamics. For instance, considerable work has been done on Egypt's influence over Syro-Palestinian territories and how internal events in Egypt shaped those relationships. Similarly, historians have closely studied the rivalry between Babylonia and Assyria, particularly in terms of power struggles and the decisions of individual rulers. However, my focus will take a different direction. Here, kings and queens, merchants and soldiers, farmers and artisans will be viewed not only through their personal actions, but as parts of a broader system, one whose complexity and interdependence likely exceeded their own awareness. Natural settings, economies, and social structures within each state, and across the region as a whole, formed the underlying foundation of this system. In many ways, the specific conditions of each state were simply local variations of a shared framework, where every participant contributed consciously or not to the survival of the entire, interconnected world. History must be approached at multiple levels of abstraction. In this work, I will not concentrate on individual characteristics, but instead aim to explore the common features shared across these cultures. features that made this era so distinctive in the context of ancient history. Specific historical events, such as battles, treaties, or political shifts, are not the central focus here, since no single event fundamentally changed the broader system. Rather, each event serves as a reflection of how the system operated and how it responded to both internal dynamics and external pressures. While these events will be mentioned, they function mainly as reference points that guide us toward a deeper understanding of the structures behind them. The type of history I aim to write aligns with what French historian Fernand Braudel described as social history. My approach is inspired by his renowned work on Mediterranean history during the reign of Philip II of Spain. A title I have consciously echoed in naming this book, but is it still valid today, especially in our postmodern intellectual climate too? Attempt to identify a systemic framework that underlies the histories of many cultures across a vast geographical region. Does this risk reviving a style of scholarship that has been criticized for decades for imposing generalized patterns on diverse peoples, disregarding their unique circumstances? And by adopting a title that echoes a study of the 16th century, AD, am I unintentionally implying that historical time in the Eastern Mediterranean remained static? Could this be seen as reinforcing the outdated Orientalist view of a timeless, unchanging Middle East? These are just some of the challenges and critical concerns a study of this kind must navigate. There are many valid ways to study a region's history, each with its own merits and purposes. The choice between emphasizing the particular versus the shared depends largely on the historian's goals and the available evidence. Microhistorical approaches, which zoom in on individuals or small communities, can be incredibly valuable. However, historians dealing with pre-modern periods rarely have enough information to reconstruct the inner lives or detailed thoughts of individuals. Even in the case of a 16th-century miller from Freely, whose ideas were recorded by the Inquisition, it was the unusual nature of his beliefs and the obsessive record-keeping of the authorities that allowed his story to survive. In ancient history, focusing on the individual often leads to biographies of kings. The life of Ramesses II, for example, has been the subject of many detailed studies. A few of his contemporaries have also received similar treatment where the historical record permits. Yet such focus inevitably leaves out the wider population. Archaeologists rightly argue that we can learn much about these people through the physical remnants of their daily lives. In certain regions, we also possess texts that shed light on everyday activities. Tombs from Egypt's New Kingdom, for instance, reveal a wealth of information, with their occupants ranging from royals to individuals who appear to belong to a middle-class segment of society. Personal archives found in various cities of the Eastern Mediterranean offer insights into the business dealings of private citizens. These individuals and their experiences certainly deserve attention and study. Ancient world, opportunities to work at this level of detail are extremely rare. More often than not, we are left with fragmentary texts and artifacts that provide little context when examined in isolation. As a result, we are frequently compelled to shift our focus away from individual stories and instead seek broader patterns by examining cultures collectively. This has led to the dominance of what might be called national histories and, admittedly, anachronistic terms such as studies of Egypt during the New Kingdom, the Hittite Empire, or Kassitera Babylonia. These accounts blend information about both rulers and ordinary people to present a broader view of each state's historical trajectory. This approach is not only valid, but often necessary. Given the nature of the sources and the limitations of the historical record, a historian can choose to step even further back, disregarding the boundaries of individual states. At this broader level of abstraction, specific events fade from focus and greater generalizations are made. Admittedly, this approach risks overlooking the unique circumstances of individuals, yet it also allows for a deeper level of comprehension, because interpreting isolated events or people without placing them within a wider context is nearly impossible. Can we truly understand a state like New Kingdom Egypt without relying on broader, conceptual frameworks about how ancient states functioned? How do we explain what we observe without immediately referring to general ideas shaped by long-standing assumptions? Of course, these frameworks often lean heavily on what previous scholars have believed, and are sometimes entangled with outdated racial, gendered, or cultural biases. That is why they must be continuously reassessed and revised. While such a macro-level perspective inevitably smooths over the rich diversity of individual lives, the belief that one can make sense of a single historical moment without any larger reference system is simply not sustainable. And what about the cliché of the Middle East as an unchanging region? By referencing Brodel's study of the 16th century Mediterranean, aim to highlight shared methods and perspectives not to equate historical realities across time. Still, some elements of a region's history do endure longer than others. Brodel introduced the idea of different layers of historical time, one of which operates on a geological scale rather than a purely human one. Humanity's relationship with the environment, the foundation of survival, changed little throughout the pre-industrial era. Even though we must account for shifts in climate over time, long-lasting patterns in farming, sailing, and trade often persisted across centuries, even millennia. Some of the behaviors Brodel documented in the 16th century AD were already evident in the 13th century BC. That said, much had changed at the level of individual experience. The political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean during the reign of Ramesses II was entirely different from that of Philip II's era. Religion, culture, and the economy had also evolved significantly. I am not arguing for deep historical continuity between these two periods, but rather suggesting that they can be examined using comparable, analytical approaches. This brings us to a fundamental question. Where do we draw the boundaries? Where should the study begin and end, and which region should be included or left out? Historians are ultimately dependent on their sources that are distributed unevenly across both geography and time. From the start, though, it is clear that the Eastern Mediterranean was dominated by literate societies. The written records indicate participation in a larger international network, which is the central concern of this study. The very act of writing reflects certain societal traits, hierarchical structures, advanced economies, and social systems that encouraged documentation and enabled some members of society to communicate in written form. Every culture discussed here experienced periods where writing was minimal or absent. Within each society, literacy was limited to a minority. Moreover, they all had contact with neighboring communities that did not use writing at all. Nevertheless, the presence of writing is a defining feature of all the civilizations covered in this work. It provides the boundaries for our investigation, even though non-written materials remain an essential source of historical knowledge as well. Defining historical boundaries based on a single characteristic, such as the presence of writing, is inherently imprecise. The discovery of a single cache of documents, for example, could shift our understanding and require us to include an additional century or a new geographic area. In the kind of historical study pursued here, such uncertainties are less troublesome than they would be in a strictly political history. This is because our focus lies on long-term developments, which rarely begin or end abruptly. This work will concentrate on the latter half of the 2nd millennium BC, though the exact time frame will remain flexible depending on the region under discussion. The beginning of this period is particularly difficult to pin down. As different cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean emerged into the historical record at various points between the 16th and 14th centuries BC in Babylonia. For instance, it was during the 14th century that kings began commissioning, building inscriptions texts that confirm their reigns and offer more concrete historical evidence than later king lists. The dynasty's political stability led to economic growth, which created the need for a more elaborate bureaucracy. This in turn left us with more detailed documentation by the mid-14th century. In Egypt. Writing never vanished entirely during the so-called Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1640 to 1539 BC, but it was mostly limited to brief inscriptions. It's far less abundant than the written records from the 15th through 13th centuries. Meanwhile, in mainland Greece, written documents appear only toward the end of the period and are sparse, in both quantity and content. In that case, archaeology is our primary source of information, which tells us that the culture in question likely began forming around 1600 BC, The end of the period is often linked to the widespread upheaval that occurred around 1200 BCA, turning point that severely impacted societies in the Aegean and the Levant. This catastrophic wave led to the destruction of many palaces and cities across Greece, Crete, Anatolia, and the coastal regions of Syrio-Palestine, abruptly ending much of what had existed. However, not all Eastern Mediterranean cultures experienced the same fate. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, while a decline set in, there was no sudden collapse. The ruling dynasties endured for about another century. Although historians of these regions do not typically mark 1200 as a strict dividing line, the signs of decline were already apparent by then, and what followed were the waning days of an era. Even in areas of Syro-Palestine, where some states survived the crisis, they gradually weakened and eventually gave way to new formations. By 1100 BC, most of the Eastern Mediterranean, apart from Egypt, had ceased using writing. If literacy did persist in some places, the evidence of it has yet to be found. To define the geographical focus of this study, it is useful to begin at the core and move outward. Once again, the presence of writing serves as our guide. The heart of this world was a crescent-shaped region extending from southern Babylonia to southern Egypt. It includes Babylonia, Assyria, northern Syria, central Anatolia, the Syro-Palestinian coast, and the Nile Valley up to Upper Nubia. In all these regions, writing was widespread. Surrounding this core were areas such as western Iran and the Aegean, where writing existed but was more limited in scope and use. All of the regions within the Eastern Mediterranean sphere maintained contacts beyond their immediate borders. The Babylonians engaged with communities around the Persian Gulf. The Assyrians interacted with eastern Anatolia and parts of northwest Iran. The Hittites had connections to the north and west. The Mycenaeans reached as far as Italy and islands in the western Mediterranean, and the Egyptians dealt with Libya and territories south and east of Nubia. The exact extent of these connections remains uncertain. Some scholars have proposed that a broader world system existed at the time, linking cultures across Eurasia with the Eastern Mediterranean as its center. However, this view likely overstates the case. Direct contact beyond formidable natural barriers, such as the Alps, the Caucasus, the Hindu Kush, the Sahara, and the Arabian deserts, was probably rare at best. It is also important not to assume that everyone in these core regions was literate or lived in settled communities. In every society, large segments of the population existed on the margins of the historical record. We know of them primarily through the writings of their literate neighbors or through sparse archaeological findings. It's partly due to their limited material resources compared to urban dwellers, but also reflects the tendency of modern archaeology to overlook them. Yet, these non-literate and mobile groups played significant roles during this entire period, and they may have been key players in the collapse of the established order. To understand their impact, we must make an effort to examine the scant and often biased sources that provide glimpses into their lives. In determining which periods and regions to include in this study, I have chosen to use the presence of written records as a primary criterion. But is this approach truly justified? After all, writing in antiquity was a skill limited to a small segment of the population, and much of what was written during the second millennium BC has either been lost over time or remains undiscovered. Moreover, writing represents only one aspect of a culture. Perhaps other indicators, such as the level of urban development, which can be measured archaeologically and is less affected by the randomness of what survives, might offer a better foundation for defining the scope of this investigation. Even so, I believe the emphasis on writing is warranted for two key reasons. First, this is a historical study, and written records are the foundation of historical research. While archaeological and geographical evidence are invaluable, it is the written texts produced by these societies that provide the most direct insights into their historical context. Second, although writing first appeared in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean as early as the late 4th to early 3rd millennium BC, its use over time was far from consistent. In the most literate and well-documented regions, Mesopotamia, in Egypt, the knowledge of writing was never entirely lost after its invention. This continuous tradition is evident in the development and persistence of scripts and writing techniques. Furthermore, the quantity and nature of written material allows us to distinguish different periods within these civilizations' histories. There is a clear link between the volume of surviving texts and the political strength of the states that produced them. Periods marked by centralized, powerful governments saw a significant increase in writing activity. Royal inscriptions became more frequent and more detailed. Expanding state bureaucracies generated large amounts of administrative documentation. Similarly, periods of economic growth led to a rise in private record-keeping. As individuals documented commercial transactions and legal matters, this pattern holds true across much of pre-modern history. Times of political fragmentation and reduced writing are often referred to as Dark Ages. The metaphor of writing as the light that guides historical inquiry is deeply rooted in how we understand the past. In the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, fluctuations in the volume of written material closely followed changes in centralized authority. The widespread use of writing between the 14th and 12th centuries BC strongly suggests that this was a period dominated by stable states and vigorous economies. For that reason, the presence of writing serves not only as a practical boundary for this study, but also as a meaningful indicator for defining the core areas and timeframes under examination. Throughout this period, history is filled with countless individuals, men and women whose actions have come down to us through recorded accounts. Yet aside from a few well-known exceptions, most of these historical figures remain unfamiliar to those outside the realm of scholarly study. A handful of personalities stand out with exceptional fame, especially within the ancient world. Ramesses II, for example, is renowned largely due to his monumental constructions and has been featured in numerous films, exhibitions, and both. Popular in academic work since the early days of deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, Queen Hatshepsut attracts attention for having ruled a major empire as a woman, Akhenaten for his radical religious changes, and Tutankhamun for the extraordinary wealth discovered in his tomb. The only royal burial from this period found intact when it was unearthed in 1922. Unsurprisingly, all of these individuals hail from Egypt, a civilization that continues to astonish with its architectural and cultural legacy. In contrast, the contemporaries of Egyptian pharaohs, rulers from neighboring states, are far less recognized, and even the names of the lands they governed remain obscure to many. To help clarify this context, I will present a broad overview of political and military events shaped by individuals, since such actions often influence how we perceive historical periods. Asterisk. Although extensive studies exist on the histories of specific states and their interactions, the account here will offer only a condensed summary, focusing more on the region as a whole rather than detailing each state individually. That said, I will highlight the case of the Kingdom of Mitanni to illustrate how the fate of a single state could be influenced by developments throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Historians aim to provide exact dates whenever possible. Modern history, we can often pinpoint the precise hour a critical decision was made. But the further we reach into the past, the less precise these timelines become. Hours become days, then months, and eventually we are left with approximate years. In ancient history, this imprecision is common, hence the frequent use of the term circa, as in Plato was born around 428 BC. While such vagueness may be frustrating, working within a consistent sequence still allows us to establish a relative chronology. For instance, Plato came after Socrates and before Aristotle. In this book, however, we are dealing with multiple historical timelines, each with its own sequence and level of precision. For civilizations like Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia, we have a fairly reliable order of rulers and knowledge of the lengths of their reigns, as these cultures base their dating systems on regnal years. In contrast, for places like Hatti, Mitanni, and Elam, our grasp of chronology is weaker. We know the names of many rulers, but how long they ruled is often unclear. In the Aegean world, we don't even have confirmed names of monarchs, relying instead almost entirely on archaeological evidence. to piece together a rough timeline. Chronology becomes even more complicated when we try to synchronize the histories of different regions. Attempting to weave these various timelines into one unified framework for the Eastern Mediterranean highlights the flaws in each system. For instance, some historians might date the reign of the Assyrian king Ossurubalit from 1365 to 1330 BC and place the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. Between 1353 and 1336 BC, others might assign different dates entirely 1353 to 1318. For Ossurubalit, in 1367 to 1354, Akhenaten, these differences drastically change our interpretation of events. If Ossurubalit corresponded with Akhenaten, as we know he did, was he writing as a seasoned ruler, addressing a relatively new king, or was it the other way around? The absolute dating systems used today are built on complex interpretations of various sources such as astronomical data in Egypt or royal lists in Assyria. The challenges grow even greater when dealing with Elam Mitanni, or Hatti. Synchronisms help, such as knowing that Ramesses II fought the Hittite king Muwatalli II in his 5th year, but even then, you can't be sure when that moment occurred. In the Hittite king's reign, chronology, in this context, feels like a fragile structure carefully constructed, yet always vulnerable to being reshaped by new findings, despite the massive scholarship behind it. Still, it remains a vital framework that allows us to talk meaningfully about the region's history. It is a tool we aim to make as accurate as possible, while acknowledging that it may be subject to change. The chronological system used in this study will hopefully remain consistent throughout. However, it is not meant to appear absolute. It is a practical structure, one open to correction, refinement, and reinterpretation. Even within this somewhat fragile chronological framework, it is still possible to construct a political history of the Eastern Mediterranean that centers on the actions of key individuals, primarily kings and military leaders. My aim is to bring some structure to the vast array of information available, revealing how this region experienced a clear trajectory of growth, flourishing, and eventual decline. Modern historians often view the concept of historical cycles with skepticism, criticizing it as overly simplistic and likening it perhaps unfairly to the stages of a human life. History, after all, doesn't repeat itself in neat loops. Still, certain historical conditions do emerge, persist for a time, and then fade away. The rise and fall of empires, for instance, doesn't mean a return to the past, but rather marks the end of a particular phase in a region's development. In much the same way, during the Late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean gave rise to a system that endured for several centuries before disappearing. This era was flanked by 2 dark ages, periods during which the archaeological and written records are so sparse that even determining the passage of time becomes difficult. Yet, between these obscure intervals, there was a time of extraordinary activity and achievement. It was an era in which the entire region evolved into a highly interconnected and complex network of societies. Around the mid-16th century BC, a student from Thebes, Egypt, transcribed an inscription originally commissioned by King Kamose, who ruled approximately 1545 to 1539 BC. In the text, King voices his frustration over the fractured political state of Egypt at the time. Why should I even acknowledge my own strength? One ruler holds avarice, another governs Kush, and here I sit, surrounded by an Asiatic and a Nubian. Each man controls a portion of Egypt. The land is carved up around me. Kamose's anger reflects the reality that Egypt, once united from the Mediterranean coast to the Second Cataract of the Nile, was now fragmented. From his base in Thebes, Kamose had no control over the Delta region or some stretches of the Nile Valley to the south, nor over the territory beyond the First Cataract. Just 150 years earlier, the ruler of Thebes had governed all of Egypt and maintained military outposts deep into Nubia. Egypt's territorial unity had been exceptional during the early part of the second millennium BC, but Egypt was not alone. In earlier centuries, large and powerful states had also existed elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the mid-18th century BC, Hammurabi ruled over united southern Mesopotamia. The king of Aleppo controlled northern Syria, and the ruler of Elam, presided over a sizable domain. By the 17th century, Hittite kings had consolidated central Anatolia under their authority. By the early 16th century, however, these empires had disappeared. Internal conflicts played a role, but the problems ran deeper. The region was left with only a handful of small power centers with limited reach, and much of the surrounding territory was held by non-urban populations. Major cities had declined or been abandoned, becoming isolated pockets surrounded by rural zones where settlements were often temporary. Economic activity and trade had slowed dramatically. As a result, very little historical record survives. From this period, the mid-2nd millennium BC remains a time of historical obscurity. Only in Egypt and Babylonia did writing continue. Even there, it was sparse. Still, from this shadowy and fragmented world, a new system eventually emerged. Out of the turmoil of the mid-2nd millennium's dark age, two major states emerged. On opposite sides of the Syro-Palestinian region, the newly formed kingdom of Mitanni in northern Syria, and a reunified Egypt entering what we now call the New Kingdom era. These two powers were initially separated by the Syro-Palestinian lands, but their expansionist ambitions eventually brought them into direct confrontation. Mitanni remains one of the enigmas of ancient history, though it held significant power. During the latter part of the 2nd millennium BC, it is scarcely known today. One major obstacle to reconstructing its history is the lack of knowledge regarding its capital. We know the city's name Washukani and that it was located somewhere in northeastern Syria or southeastern Turkey, near the headwaters of the Haber River. However, its exact location remains unknown. As a result, we lack archives from the kingdom's core, and there are no surviving royal inscriptions or king lists. Most of what we know comes from external references and records from border cities. Nevertheless, the presence of Mitanni's royal seal on clay tablets found across a wide area of northern Syria and Iraq suggests the state's reach was substantial. This influence is also confirmed by autobiographical inscriptions left by rulers who served under Mitanni authority. Around 1500 BC, Idrimi, ruler of the city of Alala, located in modern-day Turkey roughly 50 kilometers west of Aleppo, commissioned a statue of himself inscribed with the story of how he rose to power. The tale reads like a heroic legend. The younger son of an exiled royal family rises to become king. Though we shouldn't take every detail at face value, it highlights the authority held by the Mitanni king. Igni's family originally hailed from Aleppo, but had fled to Imar along the Euphrates for unknown reasons. Restless, Igni left Imar and joined a band of exiles who eventually seized control of Alalek and nearby towns. This turn of events brought him into contact with Patatarna, king of Mitanni. For 7 years, Patatarna, the mighty king and leader of the Hurrian warriors, opposed me. In the 7th year, I sent a letter to him, reminding him of the peaceful relations my ancestors had with the Hurrians. Our message pleased the Hurrian rulers, and they agreed to a binding pact. The strong king acknowledged the loyalty of my predecessors and the oath they had taken. He accepted my greeting, I restored his lost holdings, and I pledged loyalty to him. With this, I was made king in Alalak. Following Idrimi's appointment, nearby rulers attacked, but he successfully repelled them and ruled for 3 decades. Asterisk in his account. Idrimi referred to Patatarna as the leader of the Hurrian forces. The Hurrians are a people we primarily recognize today through their language. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, Hurrian had been spoken across northern Syria for centuries. Though it never became a dominant language in written records, even at the Mitanni court, Babylonian not Hurrian, was typically used in official texts, reflecting the broader linguistic norms of the Near East. Despite this, the Hurrians had, during the Dark Age, managed to establish political dominance over northern Syria and exert control over the region's diverse populations. Their kingdom became known internationally as Mitanni, with its political center located somewhere near its mysterious capital, Washukani. Mitanni's territory and influence shifted over time, but in the early 15th century BC, it was particularly far-reaching. During Idrimi's reign, the Mitanni king held sway over lands stretching from the southern coast of Anatolia west of Alalak, across northern Syria and Iraq, and as far east as the Tigris River and the Middle Euphrates. This vast area included numerous client kingdoms, all subject to the authority of Mitanni's ruler. Up until around 1350 BCE, Mitanni's dominance remained largely unchallenged. Apart from a few Egyptian military expeditions deep into northern Syria during the 15th century, some Egyptian pharaohs advanced as far as Carchemish, the key crossing point over the Euphrates River, but none of these campaigns posed a real threat to Mitanni's existence. Although Egypt and Mitanni vied for influence over the Syrian city-states located west of the Euphrates, there is no evidence of direct military conflict between the two. In fact, during the reign of Amenhotep II, 1426 to 1400 BCE, the two powers became allies, solidifying their relationship through marriage when a Mitanni princess, sister of King Tushratta, was sent to Egypt to marry the pharaoh, while Mitanni succeeded in uniting a region that had previously been politically fragmented. Egypt was pursuing a different mission. It sought to reclaim a long-standing ideal, the reunification of Upper and Lower Egypt, a symbol that had defined the Egyptian state since its earliest days. As reflected in King Kamoses's words, the ruler of Thebes deeply resented having to share power with foreign rulers, an Asiatic in the north and a Nubian in the south. Over the course of 150 years, the kings of the 18th dynasty not only expelled these foreign powers, but also carried the conflict into their adversaries' own territories. Pharaohs led military campaigns both northward and southward. In Asia, they advanced as far as the Euphrates River, about 900 kilometers from Egypt's border, and in Nubia, they reached the Fifth Cataract, over 1,000 kilometers beyond the first. Strength of Egypt's army must have been formidable, but the frequency and persistence of their campaigns indicate that they faced strong and sustained resistance. Egypt confronted very different kinds of opponents in the north and south. In Nubia, the initial resistance came from a unified kingdom centered at Kerma near the Third Cataract. This state had flourished during Egypt's Second Intermediate Period, circa 1640 to 1539 BCE. Although it likely lacked strong central authority and left no trace of an organized bureaucracy. After the Kerma state collapsed, resistance to Egyptian expansion fell to smaller mobile groups who could retreat into the desert when necessary. Egypt eventually annexed Nubia, at least as far as the Third Cataract, placing the territory under the authority of a viceroy. Beyond that, between the Third and Fifth Cataracts, Egyptians built fortified settlements at key locations and worked through local leaders, integrating them into the Egyptian administrative system. Egypt's dominance in Nubia appears to have remained intact for roughly 500 years. In contrast, Egypt's approach to Syrio-Palestine was significantly different. Its control over this northern region was far more tenuous and inconsistent. Even though its initial campaigns there occurred around the same time as those in Nubia, the nature of the early resistance Egypt encountered in Syrio-Palestine is still unclear. Kamos referred to as northern enemies as Asiatics, a term modern scholars generally associate with the Hyksos, foreign rulers who had governed the Nile Delta and parts of northern Egypt for about a century. Several Hyksos kings ruled over small individual territories, though the dynasty based in Avaris had become the most prominent. Amos, the first ruler of the Theban-led 18th dynasty, launched attacks on Hyksos strongholds in the Delta, including the city of Avaris. He then pursued the retreating forces into southern Palestine, where he met and defeated further Hyksos resistance. By crossing Egypt's traditional boundary with Asia, Amos set a precedent that would be followed by his successors in the generations to come. For over 150 years, Egyptian military forces campaigned in Syrio-Palestine in an effort to assert dominance over the region. Initially, these expeditions were lengthy raids that encountered minimal resistance from the many small city-states. Eventually, however, under the rule of Thutmose, the first 1493 BCE and onward, Egyptian forces reached the Euphrates River, where they encountered the Mitanni, whose presence marked the limit of Egyptian advance. These campaigns established a form of diplomatic supremacy, although the local rulers of Syrio-Palestine remained in place. They recognized Egypt as the leading power. This represented a new phase in Egypt's relationship with the region where earlier contact had been primarily commercial, especially with port cities like Byblos. Now it was political and imperial in nature. This new form of involvement may have posed an ideological challenge for Egypt, a state that had traditionally justified expansion through opposition to external enemies. Perhaps this is why, nearly a century after the Hyksos had been defeated, Queen Hatshepsut still referred to them as adversaries in her inscriptions, portraying her rule as a restoration of divine order after foreign disruption. Despite such rhetoric, Hatshepsut is not remembered primarily for her military campaigns. Instead, she is renowned and often admired for having assumed the throne as a woman during the minority of her nephew, Mos III. She ruled as a female pharaoh for 15 years and adopted all the formal symbols of kingship, including commissioning a grand mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. After her death in 1458 BCE, Thutmose III began ruling alone and dramatically changed Egypt's approach to Syrio-Palestine, launching a prolonged military campaign across 2 decades. He framed these campaigns as responses to uprisings by local city-state rulers. Initially, the king of Qadesh was identified as the main instigator, but later, the Mitanni monarch in the distant north became Egypt's primary rival. During his 8th campaign, Thutmose III reached the Euphrates. He led land-based operations and naval assaults using troop-carrying vessels to reach coastal cities in Syria. These campaigns secured Egypt's control over southern Syrio-Palestine. However, in the north, the strength of the Mitanni remained, sufficient to keep many local rulers within their sphere of influence. The conflict between the two powers eventually subsided under Thutmose's successor, and it appears that both sides came to a tacit agreement regarding their respective areas of control. Thutmose II's military achievements are documented in his campaign annals, which detailed the tribute he collected from defeated cities. Interestingly, even rulers who were beyond his military reach sent him lavish gifts. Thutmose treated these offerings as if they were due to him, though in the diplomatic culture of the time, such exchanges were part of maintaining friendly relations. Among the foreign dignitaries who sent gifts were kings from 5 notable realms of Syria: Babylonia, Hatti, Asi, and Tanaya. These records, dated between 1456 and 1438 BCE, demonstrate that Egypt acknowledged a network of established neighboring states. Around this time, these regions also began producing their own written records, giving historians the opportunity to study their histories more directly. One such exchange came from Babylonia, which sent lapis lazuli, a highly prized blue gemstone, sourced from Afghanistan's, a diplomatic gift after Thutmose reached the Euphrates. While the Egyptian records don't name the Babylonian king, he was likely a member of the Kassite dynasty, which ruled the region at that time. The Kassites were a distinct people with their own language and customs. They had entered Babylonia early in the 2nd millennium BCE, and after the fall of Hammurabi's dynasty around 1600 BCE, they eventually took power, though the exact timing is uncertain. By around 1475 BCE, a single Kassite ruler governed Babylonia from the area of modern Baghdad to the Persian Gulf, and by 1400 BCE, their territory extended to the Dajala Valley and even Bahrain. Despite not waging major wars, at least none that have been documented, the Kassites emerged as a dominant regional force. The Egyptian kings addressed their Babylonian counterparts as equals in diplomatic correspondence. Under Kassite rule, Babylonia transformed from a patchwork of city-states into a unified territorial kingdom. Babylon became the uncontested capital, a significant shift from the earlier political landscape where multiple cities had held competing authority. Babylonia's most significant contribution to the Eastern Mediterranean world was cultural. Its influence extended far beyond its borders, as educated elites throughout the region embraced the Babylonian language, writing system, scribal practices, and literary works. Babylonian texts were read and studied in cities like Assur in Assyria, Hattusa in Anatolia, Imar in northern Syria, Megiddo in the southern Levant, and even Akhetaten in Egypt. For diplomatic exchanges, people from as far east as western Iran and as far west as Cyprus composed their messages on clay tablets in cuneiform, most often using the Babylonian language. Even the Kassite rulers of Babylonia had largely abandoned their own customs in favor of Babylonian traditions. Their native language appears only in personal names, and their gods held only minor official roles. The art from this period shows little sign of foreign or innovative influence, reflecting a full cultural assimilation in a list of foreign kings. Thutmose III mentions rulers of two lesser-known states, Asi and Tanaya. While their exact identities remain uncertain, many scholars believe Asi refers to Cyprus and Tanaya represents mainland Greece specifically, a version of the term Danawi, used in later times for the Greeks. Both regions are challenging to study due to the nature of the surviving written records. Although palatial administrations existed in these areas, their documents were mostly restricted to bureaucratic matters. In Greece, the Linear A and Linear B scripts were used for administrative record-keeping. The Cypriot script, known as Cyprominoan, remains undeciphered, but evidence suggests it too was focused on administration rather than narrative or historical texts. As a result, we have little hope of uncovering royal names or detailed accounts of political events. Instead, we must rely on archaeology and occasional references from foreign sources to understand what occurred in these lands. Even identifying the names outsiders used for the people we recognize through material culture is uncertain. Cyprus occupies a geographically central position in the eastern Mediterranean, situated within sight of the northern Syrian coast, just over 100 kilometers. Away in southeastern Anatolia, around 70 kilometers. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Cypriots were already importing ceramic vessels from Syrio-Palestine, indicating active trade links. It is almost certain that the peoples of the mainland regions were aware of the island. In reconstructing the history of Cyprus, we must rely entirely on archaeological findings. These findings suggest that the mid-2nd millennium was a time of disruption. Settlements were abandoned, and local material culture became regionally distinct rather than uniform across the island. This period of instability ended around 1400 BCE, when larger and more cohesive settlements appeared, along with a more standardized material culture. Scholars continued to debate whether the island was divided into regional centers or unified under a central authority, possibly based in the large settlement of Mek. Cyprus was rich in copper resources, making it a critical supplier of the metal for the wider eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian diplomatic records mention a kingdom called Alassia, whose ruler was described as having access to abundant copper supplies. Most scholars associate Alassia with Cyprus, although not everyone agrees. If the identification is correct, it places Cyprus within the broader network of international relations during the Late Bronze Age. The ruler of Alassia was acknowledged as a great king by the Egyptians' recognition that may not have depended on complete control over the island. The fact that the king of Alassia corresponded with other powers using Babylonian cuneiform suggests that he had an administration familiar with both the language and the script, indicating an advanced level of bureaucratic development. The history of Alassia must largely be reconstructed from scattered references and documents produced outside the island itself. These sources indicate that around 1350 BCE, the king of Alassia was considered among the great monarchs of the time. By the end of the 13th century, however, the Hittites had taken control of the island. Shortly after that, Egyptian records noted that Alassia had fallen to the Sea Peoples, an unpredictable force that emerged at the close of the Late Bronze Age and will be examined later. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a notable increase in Mycenaean artifacts, suggesting that groups from the Aegean region may have migrated to Cyprus. As a result, the island's history after 1200 took a distinctly different course from what had come before. The Mycenaeans held sway over the Aegean during the Late Bronze Age, dominating both the Greek mainland and the nearby islands extending toward the western coast of Anatolia. Their material culture is well understood through archaeology, but historical records about them remain scarce. A reference by Thutmose III to Tanaya hints at the existence of a political entity in the Aegean, although the term itself is rare in Egyptian records. More commonly mentioned is a region called Keftia, most likely the island of Crete, from which tribute was sent to Egypt. These references imply that there were organized states in the Aegean that maintained contact with Egypt, though they provide little concrete historical detail to supplement this. We can look to Hittite sources, which offer valuable insight into Aegean affairs. They refer to a people called the Ahiawa, who lived along the western coast of Anatolia and the nearby islands. Although Ahiawa appears in records beginning in the 15th century BCE, the group became more prominent in the 13th century. During this period, the Hittite king Hattusili III referred to the Ahiawan ruler as his equal, addressing him as brother. A treaty signed by Tudalia IV with the kingdom of Amaro in northern Syria originally listed Ahiawa among the major powers of the time alongside Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria, though the name was later removed from the final version. The reason for this erasure remains unclear, but the original inclusion signals that Ahiawa was recognized as a major player in regional politics. Tudalia also launched a military campaign into Ahiawan territory and captured the city of Milawanda, likely the ancient city known later as Miletus. The identification of Ahiawa has long been debated, particularly regarding whether it corresponds to the Achaeans the name Homer used for the Greeks. This theory, proposed soon after the term Ahiawa was first discovered, remains controversial. While definitive proof is lacking, strong evidence suggests a Mycenaean, political, and military presence in western Anatolia. If this connection is valid, Homer's descriptions of Greek expansion into that area may reflect real historical events, and the archaeological remains of Bronze Age Greece could be directly linked to a group documented in written sources. Such a link would reinforce the idea that Ahiawa was one of the leading powers of the late Bronze Age. Thanks to the abundance of archaeological evidence, we are able to piece together aspects of Aegean history. The region was deeply integrated into the broader Eastern Mediterranean system of the time. Written records from the Greek mainland and Aegean islands do exist, but they are almost entirely administrative in nature. These texts help us understand the workings of Mycenaean bureaucracy, though they reveal little about historical events or political developments. The documents come from palace archives inscribed on clay tablets in a writing system known as linear. This script combines syllabic and ideographic signs and was used to record an early form of the Greek language. Tablets have been unearthed on Kretat Knossos in Kenya and on the mainland, especially at Pylos, with smaller finds at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes. However, these records are undated, do not mention kings by name, and contain no narratives of campaigns or royal achievements, making it impossible to construct a political history from them alone. The Aegean region has been extensively explored through archaeology, allowing scholars to trace political and cultural patterns to a considerable degree. Between approximately 1600 and 1450 BCE, two distinct archaeological cultures existed side by side, one centered on the island of Crete, the other on the Greek mainland. These are known as the Late Minoan and Late Helladic cultures, respectively. Late Minoan culture in Crete featured a network of large elite residences known as villas, which resembled palaces in layout and function. Among these, the palace at Naissus stood out as the most prominent and sophisticated, and it may have served as the central hub of a unified administrative system that spanned most or all of Crete. Cretan influence during this period extended throughout the Aegean islands. Although direct evidence is scarce, it is possible that Crete exercised maritime dominance, a notion supported by later Greek writers like Herodotus and Thucydides. Meanwhile, on the Greek mainland, the late Helladic period saw the emergence of a shared Mycenaean culture across southern and central regions, including the Peloponnese, Attica, and parts of eastern Thessaly. This culture is best illustrated by findings at Mycenae, although there is no definitive proof that Mycenae functioned as the political or cultural center of the entire region. The Mycenaean elite were clearly powerful and wealthy, as shown by their richly furnished tombs, and other archaeological evidence. Around 1450 BCE, the distinction between Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece faded. Mycenaean cultural elements began to dominate. Following the destruction of nearly all Minoan palace centers, on Crete, Knossos being the sole exception, the cause of this sudden transformation remains unclear. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans may have conquered the island by force, while others suggest that the transition could have been the result of internal unrest, with the Cretans subsequently adopting Mycenaean customs. The 14th and 13th centuries BCE marked the peak of Mycenaean civilization. Posing fortified palaces, especially at Mycenae and Thebes, reflect the power and affluence of a militarized elite. The elaborate tholos tombs at Mycenae, romantically named the tombs of Atreus and Clytemnestra by 19th century excavator Heinrich Schliemann, highlight the concentration of wealth in the hands of this ruling class. During this period, a remarkable cultural consistency spread across the Aegean, and Mycenaean influence extended far beyond Greece. Their presence reached into Cyprus and the Anatolian coast. Trade played a significant role in their expansion. Mycenaean artifacts have been discovered across Cyprus, Western Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. These findings indicate that the Mycenaeans were deeply integrated into the commercial networks that connected the broader Eastern Mediterranean. They also established contact with communities further west, shown by the presence of Mycenaean ceramics in Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta. Politically, the Mycenaean world likely resembled the organization found in the Syro-Palestinian region. Elites based in palace centers controlled the surrounding villages. The economy was managed through centralized planning. Figures referred to as wainaks in the Linear B tablet skings, or king-like leaders, presided over these palatial centers. A distinct martial tone characterizes the remains from mainland Greece. The massive Cyclopean walls at Mycenae are clear indicators of a society shaped by military values. However, it is unclear whether a single monarch ruled over a confederation of palaces. The question of political unity within the Mycenaean world remains unresolved. Homeric tradition portrays Mycenae as a leading power, implying a degree of cohesion, but historians debate the accuracy of that view. Most modern scholars lean toward the idea that the region was composed of multiple independent or semi-independent polish. Nevertheless, there is evidence of communication and cooperation between palaces. Linear B texts reveal contact among elites from different Mycenaean cities, and personal names of noble figures appear on tablets discovered at more than one site. This could suggest the existence of a shared aristocracy, or even a unifying dynasty. Furthermore, the uniformity of material culture, particularly in administrative records across the Mycenaean world, points to an overarching structure that imposed common practices, possibly akin to what we find in the Mitanni and Hittite political systems, situated at the western edge of the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean civilization appears to have been as formidable as other major states documented in contemporary records. Warriors from mainland Greece, operating from heavily fortified strongholds, expanded their reach across the mainland, Aegean islands, and even Crete. They also established a presence along the Anatolian coast, engaging diplomatically and militarily with groups such as the Hittites. Yet the Mycenaeans were not the region's only dominant force. On the island of Cyprus, another ruler held sway, one who was also recognized as a great king within the diplomatic sphere of Akhenaten's Egypt. In 1279 BC, Ramesses II, whose name remains well known today, came the ruler of Egypt. At the time, however, much of the known world had no idea who he was, or even that Egypt existed. Similarly, Ramesses and his people were aware of only a small portion of the outside world. Though their knowledge was greater than that of earlier generations just a few centuries before, some members of his royal court were aware of the peoples and lands that this book will explore. They had either met travelers from regions stretching from Nubia in the south to the Black Sea in the north, and from the Greek mainland to western Irano they had traveled to these places themselves. But beyond those areas, their knowledge was minimal. They may have come across objects from sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, or Atlantic Europe, but they knew nothing about the people who made them. Even for modern historians, the world in 1279 BC is largely unknown and unknowable. Most of the globe's inhabitants left behind very little for us to study. Countless communities at the time hadn't yet developed agriculture or settled ways of living. Among those who had, only a few lived in cities, and fewer still used writing. The traces of their lives are scarce and difficult to interpret. Archaeologists have managed to reconstruct some aspects of life during the 13th century BC. But we usually don't know what these people called themselves or what languages they spoke. At best, we only have a vague outline of their material existence. In many cases, even those traces are missing, since nomadic lifestyles left no permanent marks for archaeologists to find. Generally speaking, the more developed and complex a society was, especially in terms of technology and material culture, the more likely it is that we can find evidence of its existence today. By the latter half of the second millennium BC, only 3 regions in the world had developed complex societies with cities, social hierarchies, and economies that extended beyond basic survival. These cultures had grown independently in different parts of the world, and our understanding of them varies widely. In Central America, the Olmec civilization was just beginning to emerge. It would reach its peak only after 1200 BC, slightly beyond the scope of this study. Located along the southern Gulf Coast of Mexico, the Olmecs practiced agriculture and lived in early urban settlements, though they had not yet developed writing. Around 1250 BC, they began building large structures that would later become important ceremonial centers. Despite some modern theories, the Olmecs had no contact with civilizations across the Atlantic or Pacific. They created their culture entirely on their own. The other 2 advanced civilizations of the time were located on opposite sides of Asia, just south of the Central Asian steppes and deserts, and north of the Indian Ocean and Arabian Peninsula. These cultures existed as small pockets of development in the vast Eurasian landscape, surrounded by nomadic or village-based populations. Although there may have been indirect contact between them, it's unlikely that the people of either region knew the other existed. Today, historians have very different levels of access to each. In East Asia, the Shang dynasty and the Middle Yellow River Valley began using writing around 1200 BC. The written records that survive are limited to inscriptions on oracle bones and bronze vessels, mostly listing royal names or isolated events. However, the archaeological record is rich. Fortified towns, grand tombs, and large buildings. Still, our understanding of the Shang period largely depends on much later Chinese historical texts. And the inscriptions we have mainly confirm what those later sources say about early kings in Western Asia. The situation was entirely different. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast, several highly developed cultures coexisted. They left behind a wealth of written records, visual art, and archaeological evidence, allowing historians to study them in great detail. This was the world that Ramesses II and his court were familiar with. It included powerful states that matched Egypt in status and are now well known to us. Hatti, the land of the Hittites in Anatolia and northern Syria, Babylonia in southern Iraq, and Assyria in northern Iraq and eastern Syria. Beyond them lay the Mycenaean civilization of the Aegean in Greece and the Elamite kingdom of southwestern Iran. Smaller states also existed along the western Anatolian coast, in the Levant, and on Cyprus. Northern Syria had previously been united under the kingdom of Mitanni. These societies were often urban, built monumental structures, and engaged in significant economic and cultural activities. They left behind extensive written and material records. We know the names of many people from these regions, the languages they spoke, their professions, their deities, and much more. This level of insight is extraordinarily rare for the time period. If we imagine the ancient world as a dark globe, only lit where history has left a record, the eastern Mediterranean is the one clearly visible area. It is no surprise that historical narratives often describe this region as the cradle of civilization. This book will focus on the eastern Mediterranean world. It's crucial to recognize how exceptional this region was, surrounded as it was by vast territories we still know little about, though these outer regions may seem disconnected. Events there had real impacts on the more documented societies of the Mediterranean. Our understanding of these outer regions is mostly indirect, based on later parallels or brief moments when their people interacted with the Mediterranean world or traded with it. Immersed in what the historical record reveals, we can easily forget how much remains unseen. We may think we're talking about the world, but in truth we're only looking at a small, illuminated corner of an otherwise vast and largely unknown past. A history without events. The cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean can be examined in many different ways, as shown by the large body of scholarly work already devoted to them. The wide range of available sources allows for detailed political, social, economic, diplomatic, cultural, and religious histories are focused on individual societies or examining multiple cultures and their interactions. One defining feature of this region during this time was its strong sense of internationalism. The various states, though it would be inaccurate to call them nations, were aware of each other and maintained frequent diplomatic and commercial contact. Many rulers viewed themselves as part of a broader system where participants were ranked in a kind of hierarchy. The level of interaction among these states, as far as we can tell today, is unmatched in the ancient world. This has led scholars to focus intensely on the region, especially from a political angle. There is a wealth of analysis, for example, on how Egypt managed its relationships with the Syro-Palestinian states under its control, and how internal political events in Egypt shaped those relations. Similarly, the rivalry between Babylonia and Assyria for dominance has been studied closely. With much attention given to the decisions of individual kings, these political studies are essential, and the insights they provide inform every part of this book. However, my focus will be different. Rather than centering on the actions of rulers, merchants, soldiers, or farmers, I aim to examine the broader system that shaped and sustained their world, often beyond their awareness. Each state's natural environment, economy, and social structures influence not just that individual society, but also contributed to the functioning of a larger, interconnected system. At a certain level, these societies were variations on a shared condition, each part necessary to the survival of the whole. History can be approached at different levels of abstraction. In this book, I'll avoid focusing on isolated individuals or unique events. Instead, I'll explore the common elements that made this period stand out in the ancient world. Specific events such as battles or treaties won't be the central focus, because none of them, on their own, fundamentally changed the system. Rather, each event serves as a window into how the system worked and how it responded to internal and external pressures. This type of history is aligned with what the French historian Fernand Braudel called social history. My approach is inspired by his famous study of the Mediterranean in the time of Spain's Philip II. I've borrowed his title style for this book deliberately. Structuralism and Orientalism revived. Is it still valid in our postmodern era to seek out underlying systems across diverse people and cultures in a broad geographical space? Could such an approach be criticized for imposing patterns or similarities that ignore the unique situations of different groups and individuals? And by echoing the title of a 16th century history, am I suggesting that time in the Eastern Mediterranean stood still? Am I unintentionally repeating old Orientalist stereotypes that describe the Middle East as unchanging? These are valid concerns for a project like this. There are many ways to study history, each with its own value and perspective. Whether a historian emphasizes the unique over the general depends on what they aim to uncover. On a single individual or small community can be fascinating. But how often can a historian working on the ancient world access enough information to reconstruct the life and thoughts of an individual? One reason we know about the beliefs of a 16th century miller from Friuli, for instance, is because they were so unusual that they drew the attention of an inquisition obsessed with keeping records. In ancient history, focusing on individuals often means writing about kings. Ramesses II, for example, has been the subject of several books. Other rulers from his time, though fewer in number, could also be studied in detail, thanks to the available evidence. But where does that leave the rest of the population? Archaeologists rightly remind us that everyday people can be studied through material remains. In some cases, we also have texts that shed light on their lives. Tombs from Egypt's New Kingdom, for example, offer a wealth of information across a wide social spectrum, from royal family members to what might be called the middle class. Personal archives discovered in various cities around the region also reveal details about business and daily life. These individuals deserve study, and where possible, their stories should be told. Still, the opportunities to work at that level of detail are rare. More often, we are left with scattered bits of evidence that mean little on their own. As a result, historians frequently have to step back from individuals and look at the broader picture. This has led to the dominance of what we might anachronistically call national history, such as New Kingdom Egypt, the Hittite Empire, or Kassite Babylonia. These works combine information about rulers and everyday people to offer a general portrait of a society during a specific period. This approach is both reasonable and necessary, especially given the limitations of the evidence. Historians can also take an even broader step back, disregarding the boundaries between states entirely. This brings us to a higher level of abstraction, where individual events are less important. This means sacrificing some attention to individual experiences, but it also allows for greater understanding. Because interpreting specific actions or events without a broader context is impossible. How can we fully grasp the history of a state like New Kingdom Egypt without referencing broader concepts of how ancient states functioned? The way we explain the past both to ourselves and to others inevitably draws on larger frameworks, shaped by existing interpretations. Unfortunately, these frameworks often rely too heavily on assumptions from past scholars and can be tainted by outdated, biased, or even racist ideas. That's why these structures must constantly be reassessed and refined. Working at this broad level does, admittedly, simplify the complexity of lived experience. But the belief that one can truly understand a single historical event or individual without referring to a wider context is simply not true. And what of the stereotype of an unchanging Middle East? By referencing Brodel's 16th century Mediterranean study, I'm not suggesting that the Eastern Mediterranean stayed frozen in time. Rather, I'm adopting a similar method and focus. That said, some aspects of life, particularly those tied to the natural environment, did remain consistent across centuries. Brodel proposed that history unfolds on different timescales, and one of them operates at a pace closer to geology than to human history. Human interaction with nature through farming, seafaring, and basic survival remained remarkably stable. Throughout the pre-industrial age, even with changes in climate, these patterns held on for thousands of years. In fact, some of the same dynamics Brodel observed for the 16th century were already in place by the 13th century BC still. Much had changed in terms of political structures, culture, religion, and economies. The world of Ramesses II was vastly different from that of Philip II. I don't claim the two eras were fundamentally alike. Rather, I argue that they can be studied using similar historical approaches. Setting limits, how do we decide where the boundaries lie when to begin and end the story, which regions to include, and which to leave out? Historians are always dependent on their sources, which are unevenly distributed across time and geography. Still, from the outset, we can say that the Eastern Mediterranean world was dominated by literate cultures. The presence of writing is a key indicator that a society was part of the interconnected system that this book explores. The existence of written records suggests that these societies had hierarchical structures, complex economies, and sufficient development to support written communication. While all of them went through periods with little or no writing, and while most of their populations remained illiterate, the fact that writing existed at all places them within the scope of this study. These texts reflect the workings of their societies and link them to others through shared diplomatic and economic networks. Writing, then, sets the basic limits of this history, even though archaeological and non-written sources are also crucial to understanding the period, of course. Any boundary defined by a single criterion like writing is going to be flexible. A single discovery, such as a cache of texts, could reshape our picture entirely, extending the time frame or geographical scope. Fortunately, The kind of history explored here focused on long-term structures and patterns rather than political events is more tolerant of such uncertainties. We're not concerned with pinpointing exact dates when things began or ended, rather with identifying broad trends and shared developments. This study focuses on the second half of the second millennium BC, though the exact dates are fluid and can vary depending on local developments. The starting point is especially vague. In different regions, societies entered the historical record at different times between the 16th and 14th centuries BC. For example, in Babylonia, kings in the 14th century began commissioning inscriptions that confirmed their existence, names that previously appeared only in much later king lists. The stability provided by the ruling dynasty enabled economic growth, which in turn generated the bureaucracy that produced more records. That's when we begin to see more evidence of economic life. In Egypt, writing never completely disappeared, even during the so-called Second Intermediate Period. But at that time, it was limited to short inscriptions, and the volume of records was tiny compared to what we find in the 15th to 13th centuries. In mainland Greece, on the other hand, written records don't appear until very late in the period, and even then, they're limited in both use and content. For that region, archaeological data becomes our main source, allowing us to say that the culture under study began forming around 1600 BC. As for the end of the period, many associate it with the widespread upheaval around 1200 BCA time, when many societies in the Aegean and the Levant experienced sudden and dramatic collapse. Cities and palaces in Greece, Crete, Anatolia, and coastal Syrio-Palestine were destroyed, abruptly ending many established systems. However, not every part of the eastern Mediterranean was affected the same way. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, there was decline, but no sudden collapse. Ruling dynasties held on for another century or more. Political historians of those regions don't typically draw a hard line at 1200, but it's clear that signs of decline were already apparent, and that what followed marked the closing phase of a broader era. Even in regions like Syrio-Palestine, where some states survived the 1200 crisis, they entered a long, gradual decline. By around 1100 BC, nearly the entire eastern Mediterranean world except for Egypt had abandoned writing, or at least left no surviving written records. Asterisk to define the spatial boundaries of this world. It's helpful to start from the core and move outward. Once again, writing acts as our primary guide. The core region includes a crescent-shaped zone stretching from southern Babylonia to southern Egypt. This area encompasses Babylonia, Syria, northern Syria, central Anatolia, the Syro-Palestinian coast, and the Nile Valley from the delta to Upper Nubia. In all these places, writing was widely used. Bordering this core were regions where writing was present but less common, or used in more limited ways, such as western Iran to the east and the Aegean world to the west. Despite being on the margins, these regions were still connected to the core through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The Babylonians, for example, had contact with areas along the Persian Gulf, the Assyrians with eastern Anatolia and northwest Iran, the Hittites with regions farther north and west, the Mycenaeans with Italy and Mediterranean islands, and the Egyptians with Libya and territories to the south and east of Nubia. How far these connections extended is difficult to say. Some scholars have proposed a far-reaching world system stretching across Eurasia with the eastern Mediterranean as its hub. But this view likely overstates the case. Direct contact with regions beyond natural barriers like the Alps, the Caucasus, the Hindu Kush, the Sahara, and the Arabian deserts was probably rare. That said, not everyone in these core regions was literate or part of sedentary urban life. Every state included large populations who lived outside the centers of political and cultural power. People we know only through limited archaeological evidence or the passing mentions in the writings of others. These groups are often silent. In the historical record, not because they were unimportant, but because they left behind fewer material traces and have been less studied by modern archaeologists. Yet they played a critical role in this era and may even have been decisive in bringing it to an end. for that reason. This book will pay close attention to these often overlooked groups by carefully examining the limited and biased evidence that survives. We can still begin to piece together a picture of their lives and their impact on the world around them. Writing as a parameter. I've chosen to use the presence of writing as a key criterion for deciding which periods and regions to include in this study. But is that a reasonable choice? After all, in antiquity, writing was a skill held by only a small portion of the population, and much of what was written during the second millennium BC has either been lost over time or remains undiscovered. Moreover, writing is only one element of culture. Would it not make more sense to rely on other indicators like the level of urbanization, which can be assessed more consistently through archaeology and are less dependent on the chance survival of documents? Even so, I believe that focusing on written material is justified for two main reasons. First, this is a work of history, and historical research fundamentally depends on written sources. While archaeological and geographical data are essential, it's the texts left behind by these societies that give us the clearest context and understanding of their world. Second, although writing was known in many parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, as early as the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BC, its use wasn't constant across time or place. In regions like Mesopotamia and Egypt where we find the most extensive written records, the ability to write was never lost after its original development. That continuity is evident in the evolution of their scripts and writing systems.
However,
the amount of writing produced in these societies changed over time, and these changes often reflect broader historical patterns. The volume of written material is closely tied to political developments. When a state was strong and centralized, the use of writing increased. Royal inscriptions became more frequent and more detailed. Bureaucracies expanded, and with them, the volume of administrative records. Private individuals also generated more documents during these times, reflecting a more active and complex economy. This pattern holds true across much of pre-modern history. It's no coincidence that times of political fragmentation are often referred to as Dark Ages, a term that metaphorically reflects the historian's lack of textual evidence. As if the light of history has dimmed. In the Eastern Mediterranean, in particular, the rise and fall of centralized power directly influenced how much writing was produced. The fact that written records became so widespread between the 14th and 12th centuries BC is itself a sign of the strength of states and the extent of economic development during this time. That's why the presence of writing is not just a helpful clue, it's a reliable way to define the time frame and identify the regions that belonged to the core of the historical world under study. Asterisk. Many individuals played a part in shaping the history of this period, and thanks to written records, historians have been able to recover some of their stories. But with few exceptions, most of these figures are only known within academic circles. A handful, however, are widely recognized, especially in connection with ancient Egypt. Ramesses II is one of the most famous, largely because of the grand monuments he left behind. His legacy has inspired films, exhibitions, and countless books, both academic and popular, especially since Egyptian hieroglyphs were first deciphered. Queen Hatshepsut is well known for ruling Egypt as a woman in a time of empire. Akhenaten stands out because of his radical religious reforms, and Tutankhamun became a global icon after the discovery of his richly furnished tomb in 1922. Remarkably untouched by looters, it's no coincidence that these famous figures all came from Egypt, civilization that still captures the imagination. Today, through its monumental ruins and historical splendor, the rulers of other states in the region during the same era are far less well known. In fact, even the names of some of their kingdoms are unfamiliar to most people outside of specialized historical studies. To offer some clarity, I will present a general overview focused on political and military developments. This will highlight the actions of key individuals whose decisions often structure our understanding of the past. Extensive scholarly work exists on the histories of each individual state, including detailed analyses of their interactions. What I offer here is only a brief summary, intended to provide a regional perspective rather than an in-depth look at each kingdom. I will, however, use the kingdom of Mitanni as a case study to show how the fate of one state was shaped by events. Across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, a note on chronology historians aim to provide date-side, delete precise ones. In modern history, we can often pinpoint the exact hour a critical decision was made. But the further we go back in time, the less accuracy we can achieve. Hours become days, then months, then years. In ancient history, we frequently have two. Usurka, as in Plato, was born around 428 BC. These approximations may be frustrating, but as long as we work within a clear sequence, we can at least build a reliable relative timeline. For example, Plato came after Socrates and before Aristotle. In this book, we must work with many different timelines, each tied to its own local chronology. Some of these are relatively solid, such as those for Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia, where we know the order of rulers and the lengths of their reigns fairly well. Other timelines are much more uncertain. For kingdoms like Hatti Mitanni and Elam, we know the names of many rulers, but not how long they ruled. In the Aegean world, we're even less certain. We often don't know the rulers' names at all. There, we depend entirely on archaeological evidence, which can only offer rough dating. Chronology becomes especially important when we try to connect different historical sequences and create a unified timeline across the Eastern Mediterranean. This is where we begin to see the weaknesses of each system. One scholar might say the Assyrian king Assurya-Bulit reigned from 1365 to 1330 BC, while Akhenaten of Egypt ruled from 1353 to 1336. Another might give Assur-Ubalit's reign as 1353 to 1318 and Akhenaten's as 1367 to 1350. These differences matter. When Assur-Ubulit wrote to Akhenaten, as we know he did, was he a seasoned ruler addressing a younger counterpart? Or was it the other way around? The absolute chronologies we use are based on complex reconstructions, drawing on evidence that can be interpreted in different ways. For Egypt, it involves the Sothic cycle. For Assyria, various royal lists. The problems grow even more complicated for Elam, Mitanni, and the Hittites. Synchronisms of moments when the histories of different states intersect are helpful. For instance, we know Ramesses II fought the Hittite king Muwatalli II in his 5th year on the throne. But we don't know what year of Muwatalli's reign that was. The whole system of ancient chronology feels, at times, like a house of cards, carefully built, but fragile, despite the vast scholarship behind it. Still, it is an essential tool. It gives structure to how we understand the region's history. The system used in this book aims to be consistent, but it is not meant to appear infallible. It's a framework of convenience open to correction and improvement as new. Evidence emerges. Asterisk within this chronological framework, however uncertain, it's still possible to tell a political history of the Eastern Mediterranean. One centered on the actions of individuals, mostly kings and military leaders. My aim is to bring some structure to the many facts we know, to reveal a pattern, one of growth, flourishing, and eventual decline. Today, some historians view this idea of history following a cycle with skepticism, arguing that it oversimplifies complex events or wrongly compares historical periods to stages in a human life. And its true history doesn't repeat itself in a fixed pattern, but certain historical conditions do emerge, thrive for a time, and then vanish. Empires rise and fall. This doesn't mean things return to the way they were before, but rather that the imperial phase of a region's story has a clear beginning and end. In the Eastern Mediterranean, during the Late Bronze Age, such a system emerged, lasted for several centuries, and then disappeared. It was surrounded on either end by periods often referred to as Dark Ages, times when the written and archaeological evidence is so limited that historians are left unsure even about the full span of years involved. Yet between those dark ages, there was a vibrant era of activity, innovation, and connection across the region. It is this period of high complexity that this book is devoted to understanding. A dark age in the middle of the second millennium, sometime in the mid-16th century BC. A student in Thebes, Egypt, copied down the words of a past king, Kamos, who had once voiced deep frustration over Egypt's fragmented state. At that time, Egypt, which had once been unified from the Mediterranean coast, too far up the Nile was divided. Kamos ruled from Thebes, but he had no control over the Nile Delta or parts of the southern valley. Even the region beyond the first cataract into Nubia was no longer under his authority. Just 150 years earlier, a ruler based in Thebes had controlled all of Egypt and even extended influence deep into Nubia. Egypt's unity had been impressive in the early part of the second millennium BC, but other powerful states had existed across the eastern Mediterranean as well. In the mid-18th century, Babylon under Hammurabi had united southern Mesopotamia. Aleppo had ruled over northern Syria, and Elam had governed a large territory. In central Anatolia, the Hittites had also risen to power in the 17th century, but by the early 16th century BC, all of these once great states had either collapsed or shrunk dramatically. Many of their problems stemmed from internal conflicts, but more severe disruptions had also played a role. What remained were a few scattered centers of power, each with limited territorial control. Much of the region had reverted to a more rural and unstable state. Cities that had once been major hubs of life and commerce were now abandoned or greatly diminished. Settlements had become more temporary, and long-distance trade had largely disappeared. With such a collapse in urban life and economic complexity, historical records dried up. The mid-second millennium left us with almost no written history. Only in Egypt and Babylonia was writing still practiced, and, even there, only to a limited extent. Despite this darkness, something new was about to emerge. From this fragmented and quiet world, a new and interconnected system would eventually rise. 1500 BCE, the first superpowers, Mitanni and Egypt's new kingdom emerging from the chaos of the mid-second millennium BCE, two powerful states arose on opposite sides of the Syro-Palestinian region. In northern Syria, the entirely new state of Mitanni took shape, while in Egypt, a reunited kingdom was established, what we now call the New Kingdom. These two rising powers were initially separated by the lands of Syria and Palestine, but their expansionist ambitions soon brought them into contact and competition. Mitanni remains one of the more mysterious powers of ancient history. Although it was a major force during the second half of the second millennium BCE, it is largely forgotten today. One of the main reasons is that we don't know where its capital, Washukani, was located. We know the name, and we believe it was somewhere in northeastern Syria or southern Turkey, near the Habur River's source, but its exact location has yet to be found. Because of this, we have no archives from Mitanni's core territory, no royal inscriptions, no king lists. Most of what we know about the state comes from outside sources or cities on its fringes. Nevertheless, the reach of Mitanni's power is evident. The royal seal of its king Sashtatar appears on tablets found across a broad region from the east of the Tigris River to west of the Euphrates. This shows how far Mitanni's influence extended. A key first-hand glimpse into its power comes from a statue commissioned around 1500 BCE by Idrimi, the king of Alalak, a city located in modern-day Turkey, about 50 kilometers west of Aleppo. The statue tells the story of how Idrimi, a younger son of an exiled ruling family, rose to power. Though the account reads like a tale and shouldn't be taken literally, it highlights the authority of the Mitanni king Paratarna. Idrimi recounts that after years of being at odds with Mitanni, he reached out to Paratarna, reminding him of past alliances between their families. His plea worked. The Mitanni king accepted his message and restored Idrimi's family holdings. Idrimi swore loyalty to him and became the ruler of Alalak, where he would reign for 30 years. This episode shows that, by Idrimi's time, the Mitanni king had the authority to recognize and install rulers across northern Syria and even beyond the Tigris, though we call them Hurrians. The people of Mitanni are mainly identified by their language, which had been spoken in the region for centuries. Oddly, even in the Mitanni court, Hurrian was rarely used in writing. Babylonian, the the dominant written language of the time, remained the primary language for official documents. The Hurrians had somehow risen to dominate the region during the earlier Dark Age and had imposed their rule over a wide area, forming a kingdom that came to be known internationally as Mitanni. During the early 15th century BCE, Mitanni held sway over a vast zone. From the southern Anatolian coast, west of Alalak, to territories east of the Tigris, and deep into the Euphrates Valley. It governed through a network of client kingdoms throughout northern Syria and Iraq. Mitanni's supremacy went mostly unchallenged until around Mitanni's 1350 BCE. Egyptian kings had conducted military campaigns in northern Syria during the 15th century, reaching as far as Carchemish, which guarded a strategic crossing of the Euphrates. But these raids never truly threatened Mitanni's core power. While both Egypt and Mitanni vied for influence over western Syrian states, they avoided direct confrontation. Eventually, during the reign of Egypt's Amenhotep II, the two powers formed an alliance, which was sealed by a royal marriage, a Mitanni princess. The sister of King Tushratta was sent to marry the Egyptian pharaoh, while Mitanni was building a new state from formerly fractured lands. Egypt was focused on reuniting what it considered its natural domain, Upper and Lower Egypt. As Kamos had complained in a previous era, Egypt had once been splintered between foreign and local rulers. Over roughly 150 years, kings of Egypt's 18th dynasty not only expelled the foreign, Hyksos rulers, but also began aggressive military campaigns both north into Asia and south into Nubia. Egyptian armies marched as far as the Euphrates River, about 900 kilometers from Egypt's traditional border and deep into Nubia. Reaching the fifth cataract of the Nile, over 1,000 kilometers south, the Egyptian military must have been formidable, though the frequency of their campaigns indicates strong and persistent resistance. In Nubia, Egypt first encountered a unified kingdom centered around Kerma, near the third cataract. This kingdom had thrived during Egypt's earlier period of political weakness, although it likely wasn't tightly centralized. Once Kerma collapsed, opposition came from more scattered local groups who could retreat into the desert when necessary. Egypt annexed Nubia as far as the third cataract and placed it under a viceroy's control between the third and fifth cataracts. The Egyptians built fortified towns and relied on cooperation with local rulers, cuing them into their administrative system. This control over Nubia remained mostly unchallenged for the next 500 years. Egypt's approach to the lands of Syria and Palestine, however, was very different. Although Egypt began its campaigns there at the same time as in Nubia, its grip on the region was far less secure. The nature of the resistance Egypt faced is unclear, but the enemies were broadly referred to as Asiatics, Alable scholars, linked to the Hyksos, the foreign rulers who had once controlled northern Egypt. One dominant Hyksos dynasty ruled from the city of Avaris in the Nile Delta. Amos, the founder of Egypt's 18th dynasty, attacked Hyksos cities like Avaris, then pursued them into southern Palestine and defeated them there too. He was the first Egyptian king in generations to push past Egypt's traditional borders into Asia, setting a precedent for his successors. For the next 150 years, Egyptian armies campaigned regularly in Syrio-Palestine to establish dominance. In the early stages, they faced little organized resistance from small city-states, but this changed. King Thutmose I eventually reached the Euphrates, only to be blocked by Mitanni's presence, though his campaigns expanded Egyptian influence. They did not eliminate Mitanni's power. Egypt maintained indirect control through diplomacy. Local rulers in Syrio-Palestine remained in place, but pledged loyalty to the pharaoh. This was a shift from earlier Egyptian strategies, which had focused on trade, especially with coastal cities like Byblos. Egypt had traditionally needed an enemy to justify its expansion, and that mindset lingered. Even Queen Hatshepsut, nearly a century after the Hyksos had been driven out, still spoke of them as enemies to validate her rule. Hatshepsut, however, is remembered less for military conquests and more for being a rare woman to take the throne as pharaoh. She ruled for 15 years as king in all but gender and commissioned. Monumental building projects like her temple at Deir el-Bahri, asterisk after her death. Thutmose III took full control and began 2 decades of intense campaigning in Syrio-Palestine. He presented these wars as responses to rebellion, targeting city-states and eventually the distant Mitanni kingdom. On his 8th campaign, he reached the Euphrates and also launched sea attacks on port cities in Syria. His efforts solidified Egypt's dominance in southern Syria and Palestine. However, Mitanni's influence remained strong in the north. Local rulers there stayed loyal to it. Eventually, during the reign of Thutmose, the third successor, Egypt and Mitanni moved away from hostility. 2 powers appear to have settled into a mutual understanding, dividing the region into separate spheres of influence. In the 1450 BCE, a second wave of state formation in the records of his military campaigns in Syria. Thutmose III proudly listed the tribute he received from conquered foes. But even groups beyond his army's reach sent him lavish gifts. Thutmose III treated these offerings as if they were owed to him, but in reality, they were part of a diplomatic exchange system meant to build friendly relations. Among the list of foreign rulers who sent gifts were 5 kings representing Assyria: Babylonia, Hatti, a place called Asi, and another known as Tanaya. This shows that by around 1450 BCE, specifically between 1456 and 1438 BCE, Egypt recognized the presence of other unified, powerful states in the region. Around the same time, local sources from those areas begin to appear, giving us a better window into their internal histories. Babylonia sent lapis lazuli, a deep blue, semi-precious stone from Afghanistan to Egypt after Thutmose III reached the Euphrates. The Babylonian king isn't named in the Egyptian record, but he likely belonged to the Kassite dynasty, which ruled Babylonia at the time. The Kassites were a distinct group with their own language, religion, and customs. They had entered the region earlier in the 2nd millennium BCE, and following the fall of Hammurabi's dynasty around 1600 BCE, eventually took control of Babylonia. By around 1475 BCE, a single Kassite king ruled a territory stretching from modern-day Baghdad to the Persian Gulf. By 1400 BCE, their domain had expanded to include the Dejala Valley and even the island of Bahrain. Though they didn't engage in major military campaigns, at least not ones we know of, they were still recognized as major powers. In diplomatic letters, even Egypt addressed the Kassite king as an equal. The Kassites transformed Babylonia from a patchwork of city-states into a unified territorial kingdom. Babylon became the true capital, and other cities lost their former political dominance, a major shift in the region's structure. Babylonia's most significant influence across the eastern Mediterranean, educated people adopted Babylonian language, writing, and literature. Babylonian texts were read as far afield as Assur, Hattusa, Imar, Megiddo, and even in Egypt, at Akkata. Diplomatic correspondence across the region from western Iran to Cyprus was written in Babylonian cuneiform on clay tablets. Interestingly, the Kassites themselves adopted Babylonian culture almost entirely. Their own language and traditions faded from official use, and the art of their time shows little trace of Kassite uniqueness. Thutmose III also named 2 other foreign lands, Asi and Tanaya, though their exact identities remain uncertain. Many scholars believe Asi refers to Cyprus, and Tanaya might correspond to the Greek mainland, possibly an early term for the Danawi, later known from Homer as the Greeks. Both regions are difficult to study because of limited written evidence. Though writing existed in both places, it was used almost entirely for administrative purposes. Cyprus had the Cypro-Minoan script, which hasn't yet been deciphered, and the Greek mainland used Linear A and later Linear B, which recorded mostly inventory and bureaucratic matters. These sources rarely mention rulers or events, so we must turn to archaeology and foreign references for insights into their histories. Cyprus lies at the heart of the eastern Mediterranean and is easily visible from both the Syrian coast and southeastern Anatolia. As early as the 2nd millennium BCE, Cypriots were importing pottery from Syria-Palestine, and their neighbors were certainly aware of the island. Archaeological evidence shows that around the mid-2nd millennium, Cyprus experienced a period of social disruption. People abandoned settlements, and material culture became more regional. But around 1400 BCE, the island saw a resurgence. Larger, more uniform settlements appeared, and a shared culture spread across the island. It's still debated whether Cyprus was politically unified at that time or divided into smaller regional centers. One large city in Kami may have served as a capital. Cyprus was also rich in copper, which made it an essential player in the regional economy. Egyptian diplomatic records refer to a ruler of Alassia Kingdom, believed by many to be located on Cyprus, who controlled large supplies of copper. If this identification is correct, then Cyprus played a key role in international politics during the Late Bronze Age. The king of Alassia, who corresponded with Egyptian kings in Babylonian script, must have had an organized bureaucracy fluent in the dominant diplomatic language of the time, although we don't have much written material from Alassia itself. References from other regions show that by around 1350 BCE, it was considered one of the great powers. Later, in the 13th century BCE, the Hittites conquered the island. Not long after, Egyptians reported that Alassia fell to the Sea Peoples, a group of mysterious seaborne raiders who disrupted the region at the end of the Bronze Age. Around the same time, Mycenaean material culture becomes more prominent on Cyprus, suggesting a wave of migration from the Aegean. Cyprus's later history thus took a very different course from its earlier development. In the Aegean, Mycenaeans dominated mainland Greece and the surrounding islands during the Late Bronze Age. Their civilization is well documented archaeologically, but historical records are sparse. The mention of Tanaya by Thutmose III suggests that at least one political center existed in the region. Egyptian sources more often refer to Keftiu, which is generally accepted to mean Crete, and mention that its people brought tribute to Egypt. These records confirm that the Aegean had contact with Egypt, though they offer little in terms of historical narrative. Here, Hittite records become more useful. They refer to a group called the Ahiawa, located on the west coast of Anatolia and nearby islands. This name has appeared in documents since the 15th century BCE, though the Ahiawa only became politically significant in the 13th century. At that time, the Hittite king Hittite-Sili III addressed the Ahiawan king as an equal. A treaty written during the reign of Tudela IV even listed Ahiawa alongside Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria as one of the major powers, though the name was later erased from the document for reasons unknown. Regardless, its inclusion reflects the high status Ahiawa held in the region. Tudela also launched a campaign into Ahiawan territory, capturing the city of Milawanda, likely the same as classical Miletus. The identification of Ahiawa with the Homeric term Achaeans, meaning the Greeks, has long been debated. Though not all scholars agree, the theory has strong support. If true, it means that the Homeric depiction of Greek involvement in Western Anatolia, such as the legendary Trojan War, may have some historical basis. More importantly, it allows us to connect the archaeological remains of Mycenaean Greece with written evidence from the time, confirming that they were indeed a powerful force in the region. From the archaeological record, we know that the Aegean was fully integrated into the wider world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Written materials from the region, such as the Linear B tablets found at palaces in Naissus, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes, give us insight into the bureaucratic structure of Mycenaean civilization. The texts were written in an early form of Greek, using a mix of syllabic signs and ideograms. However, because these records are purely administrative, they don't provide names of kings or accounts of historical events. As a result, we must rely mostly on archaeology and foreign records to reconstruct the political history of the Aegean world. Archaeology has provided a detailed picture of political and cultural developments in the Aegean world between roughly 1600 and 1450 BCE. Two distinct civilizations flourished in the region, one on the island of Crete and the other on the Greek mainland. Scholars refer to these as the late Minoan and late Helladic cultures, respectively. Asterisk on Crete, the Minoan civilization was organized around a network of large, elite residences, often called villas, that resembled palaces in their layout. These were spread across the island, with Knossos standing out as the largest and most elaborate center. It's possible that Knossos functioned as the core of a centralized Minoan system that unified the island. Minoan influence spread widely across the Aegean during this time. Although it's hard to prove, later Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides believed the Minoans had a powerful navy that allowed them to dominate the seas. Asterisk, meanwhile. On the Greek mainland, a common Mycenaean culture took shape during the late Helladic period. This culture spanned southern and central Greece from the Peloponnese through Attica to eastern Thessaly. The archaeological finds at Mycenae best represent this era, but there's no evidence that Mycenae was the central political or cultural hub. The Mycenaeans were clearly ruled by an elite class, as seen in their richly equipped graves and the wealth of goods buried with them. Around 1450 BC, a dramatic shift occurred. The distinction between Minoan Crete and the Mycenaean mainland disappeared. Mycenaean culture came to dominate Crete. Following a sudden destruction of nearly all Minoan palace centers except for Knossos, it's still unclear what caused this upheaval. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans may have invaded Crete, while others argue the island's inhabitants may have willingly adopted Mycenaean culture after a period of internal crisis. The following centuries, the 14th and 13th centuries BC, marked the peak of Mycenaean civilization. Palaces built during this time were heavily fortified, reflecting the power and wealth of a militarized elite, particularly at sites like Mycenae and Thebes. The Grand Thalos tombs at Mycenae, famously though incorrectly named the tombs of Atreus and Clytemnestra, demonstrate the elite's control over precious materials and skilled craftsmanship. Throughout the Aegean, there was a high level of cultural unity. Mycenaean influence extended far beyond Greece, reaching Cyprus, western Anatolia, and parts of the Near East. Trade played a major role in Mycenaean society, as artifacts from their culture have been found in Cyprus, Syria-Palestine, Egypt, and beyond. They also maintained contact with communities further west. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta. Politically, the Mycenaean world likely resembled the structure of the city-states in Syrio-Palestine. Palace elites oversaw nearby villages and managed a centrally organized economy. Linear B texts refer to rulers with the title Wainax, a term that roughly means king. The strong emphasis on military architecture, such as the massive Cyclopean walls at Mycenae, suggests a society deeply oriented toward warfare and defense. However, we still don't know whether a single supreme ruler united these palaces or if they operated independently within a loose network. Homeric epics later portrayed the Mycenaean world as a unified kingdom under Mycenae's leadership, but most historians today believe the region was divided into several small polities. Still, evidence from the Linear B tablets shows that there were connections between different palace centers. Elites from various regions are mentioned in records from multiple sites, and the widespread similarity of artifacts and administrative practices suggests that some kind of coordination or shared structure may have existed. If so, the Mycenaean system could have functioned similarly to the organized empires of the Mitanni or the Hittites. In short, the Aegean world, especially the Mycenaean part, was likely home to a major power in the late Bronze Age. Warriors, living in fortified cities, controlled much of the Greek mainland and islands, including Crete. They also had a presence along the western coast of Anatolia, where they interacted with the Hittites and others. Yet they were not the only rulers. In the region, on Cyprus, another king held power, and during the reign of Akhenaten in Egypt, he too was acknowledged as one of the great monarchs of the eastern Mediterranean world. 1350 BCE, the final three, Elam, Assyria, and Haddon, the eastern edge of the eastern Mediterranean world, a new state emerged around 1400 BCE that may have been just beyond the view of the Egyptians and Hittites. But it played an important role in the affairs of Babylonia and Assyria. This state was Elam. The region had been home to powerful states since the earliest days of urban life in the Near East. And during the 18th century BCE, its Mesopotamian neighbors had recognized Elam as the leading power in the area. However, in 1764 BCE, Elam suffered a major defeat at the hands of Hammurabi of Babylon, which brought its period of foreign influence to an end. For centuries afterward, Elam remained divided and weak. Around 1400 BCE, a new dynasty succeeded in uniting a large territory stretching roughly 400 kilometers, from the lowland city of Susa to the highlands of Anshan. These two cities became the foundations of royal power, as shown by the title King of Anshan and Susa, adopted by most Elamite rulers in the later 2nd millennium BCE. However, we don't know exactly how strong their control was over the areas between the two cities. While inscriptions bearing royal names help identify which regions were under their rule, we lack enough evidence from areas outside Susa to determine whether the countryside was fully integrated into the state. Still, based on written records, we can envision an Elamite state that stretched along the western slopes of the Zagros Mountains. From Susa, in the modern Khuzestan region, to Anshan, in present-day Fars province, reaching as far as the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, Elam's political history during this period remains unclear until the mid-13th century BCE, as noted earlier, around 1450 BCE. Thutmose III of Egypt claimed to have received gifts from Assyria, located in what is now northern Iraq. At the time, Assyria was still a minor power. The kingdom of Mitanni dominated the region. However, Assyria gradually transformed itself from a small city-state centered around the city of Ashur into a major territorial power with increasing influence in regional politics. Our main sources are the royal annals, which tend to emphasize military campaigns as the cause of this rise, but diplomacy also played a critical role in Assyria's growing international status. Though it was often backed by military strength, the first important Assyrian king of this era was Assurbanipal, reigning from 1363 to 1328 BCE. He consolidated control over Assyria's heartland, the area known as the Mosul Triangle and the Tigris River Valley, reaching as far south as Assur. Before this, Assyria likely functioned as a city-state, with Assur dominating only its surrounding area. During the 15th century BCE, it may even have been a vassal of Mitanni. Assurbanipal took advantage of Hittite pressure on Mitanni to seize control of its eastern territory. He then positioned himself as a significant international figure. In letters to the Egyptian king, he demanded recognition equal to that of the Mitannian ruler. This move drew an angry response from Bernabarius II, king of Babylon, who urged the Egyptian king not to treat Assyria as an equal, insisting that Assyria was his subordinate. Still, Assyria's rising power could not be denied. To secure diplomatic ties, Bernabarius II even married an Assyrian princess, Mubalit, to Cherua. Their son Karahardash was later killed during an uprising. Assurbanipal responded by intervening. In Babylonian politics, he deposed the new Kassite king and installed Kurigalzu II, likely his grandson. By 1350 BCE, Assurbanipal had firmly established Assyria's place on the international stage. The final major player in the region was the Hittite kingdom, known as Hatti, in the texts of the Hittites themselves and in those of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians. Its capital was the city of Hattusa in central Anatolia, which has provided us with a large archive of written documents detailing political affairs. Reconstructing the history of Hatti, however, is not easy, especially when it comes to exact dates. The Hittites left no detailed king lists with the lengths of reigns, and even the reign of Suppiluliuma I, the great architect of the New Kingdom period, is debated with estimates ranging from 22 to 40 years. No event in Hittite history can be firmly dated without connections to Egyptian, Assyrian, or Babylonian timelines. Such synchronizations are rare and mostly come from the later stages of Hittite history. So, while we use estimated dates for Hittite rulers, they may need to be revised, especially if Egyptian chronology changes. The borders of the Hittite state constantly shifted. Its core territory was the central Anatolian plateau, especially the Halys River basin, kingdom expanded mainly toward the south, eventually controlling much of Syria, even reaching Canaan. It's uncertain whether Hittite control in the north and west extended to the Black Sea or the Aegean coast, though these areas were geographically closer to Hattusa than Syria was. The Hittite state didn't function through direct administration. Like modern states, instead it maintained dominance over a network of client kingdoms and vassal states. As a result, the kingdom's borders were defined more by political loyalty than by hard boundaries. Throughout this era, the Hittites focused more on Syria than on the more distant regions of Anatolia, meaning the political center of the Hittite world was actually on its southern edge. The Hittite kingdom had a relatively short lifespan from roughly 1800 to 1200 BCE. It went through two major periods of strength. The first, known as the Old Kingdom, took place in the 17th century BCE. After a period of decline, the Hittites rose again around 1400 BCE during what's called the New Kingdom. During the recovery period, a number of little-known kings too, of whom were named Tudalia, gradually restored Hittite power. By the early 14th century BCE, the kingdom had regained control over central and southern Anatolia, including Kitsawatna, a key region on the southeastern coast that had previously been under Mitanni's influence. The Hittites also forced Aleppo, the dominant city of northwestern Syria and gateway to the southern lands, to switch allegiance from Mitanni to Hatti, in Syria. Hatti faced stiff competition from both Egypt and Mitanni. Egypt and Mitanni had previously clashed, but eventually formed an alliance around 1400 BCE to counter growing Hittite influence. Their improved relations are reflected in diplomatic marriages and a series of friendly letters exchanged between their courts. Egypt even tried to strengthen ties with Artsawa, a state west of Hatti, and proposed a marriage alliance. The western and northern regions posed significant problems for the Hittites. The Gazga people, who lived along the southern coast of the Black Sea, attacked and may have even destroyed Hattusa itself. In the west, a vassal named Matawata seized control of southwestern Anatolia and Cyprus. Despite these setbacks, King Suppiluliuma, reigning 1350 to 1322 BCE, turned the tide. Even while his father Tudalia III was still on the throne, Suppiluliuma had already proven to be an exceptional military leader, ultimately built a powerful state that would dominate the political landscape of the region for the next 150 years. Suppiluliuma crushed Mitanni and pushed Egyptian influence back. He and his successors were central figures in the power struggles that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean. After the emergence of these great regional states,